Welcome to the mystical tales of a tiring and stressful day. Before we begin, take some time for yourself. Relax your shoulders a little. Release the tension you hold in your jaw, neck, and the small muscles around your eyes. There is nowhere you need to be right now, nothing that demands your immediate attention. The day, with all its demands and obligations, is over, and this time belongs only to you and to rest. Slowly, take deep breaths, allowing the air to fill your lungs effortlessly or without thought. Feel the weight of your body against the surface supporting you, feel the blanket settling around you with gentle pressure. Notice how quiet the room becomes, how the sounds of the outside world become something distant and insignificant. You are safe here, warm here, enveloped by the quiet darkness that invites sleep. Allow your thoughts to slow down, like a stream meeting wider waters. There is no need to chase or push them away. Just let them flow, becoming softer, less distinct, until they are nothing more than shadows moving on the surface of your mind. Your breath has now found its own rhythm, steady and calm, gently carrying you toward rest. And as you settle deeper into this stillness, imagine yourself distancing yourself from the present moment, leaving behind today's worries and tomorrow's expectations, and instead walking toward a different time, a quieter place. Where the pace of life slows and the night has its own unique tranquility. In a village nestled among the soft hills of England, where the roads were still made of packed earth and stone, where the church bells marked the hours with their familiar voice, there stood an inn. It was not a grand establishment, not one of the coaching houses that lined the main thoroughfares where the London mail passed through with its cargo of letters and important passengers. This was a smaller place, serving the local farmers who came to market, the occasional traveler who had wandered from the busier roads, the villagers themselves who gathered in its common room when the weather turned cold and their own hearths seemed less welcoming than the larger fire that burned there. The inn had stood in its place for longer than anyone could remember with certainty. The oldest residents of the village, those whose memories stretched back to childhoods in the reign of the previous monarch, recalled their own grandparents speaking of it as already established, already familiar. The building itself showed this age in the thickness of its walls, in the way the floors had settled and shifted over decades until they were no longer quite level, in the deep windowsills worn smooth by countless arms that had rested there while gazing out at the street. It was built of stone, the kind of warm gray stone that characterized the region, with a roof of slate that had weathered to dark pewter. The windows were small and thick-paned, set deep into the walls, and in the evening they glowed with the soft light of oil lamps and candles. Above the door hung a painted sign, though the image it bore had faded over the years until only the suggestion of its original subject remained, a stag perhaps, or a plough, some emblem that had seemed significant to its first proprietor. The common room occupied most of the ground floor, a space both substantial and intimate, with a ceiling supported by dark beams that had been there since the inn's construction. The walls were plastered and had been painted at some point in the past, though the color had mellowed to a neutral cream that seemed to absorb and soften the light rather than reflect it. Against one wall stood the great hearth, built of the same stone as the building's exterior, large enough that a man could stand within it if he stooped slightly. The fire grate was made of iron, blackened by decades of use, and around it were arranged the necessary implements, the poker, the tongs, the small shovel for managing the coals. The floor was made of wide planks, oak perhaps, worn smooth by the passage of feet and darkened with age and the application of countless scrubbings. Here and there, small rugs had been placed, their patterns long since faded to indistinct shadows of their original colors. The furniture was sturdy rather than elegant, built for use rather than display. Several tables of varying sizes stood about the room, their surfaces bearing the marks of years, small gouges and stains that told of spilled drinks and carelessly set down objects. Around these tables were arranged chairs and benches, all of simple construction with plain wooden seats and backs, though a few had cushions tied to them, stuffed with horsehair and covered in dark fabric. Along the walls stood additional pieces, a tall cupboard that held the inn's supply of crockery and glasses, a sideboard where the keeper prepared drinks and kept his accounts. In one corner, a narrow staircase led to the upper floor where the sleeping rooms were located, its banister polished by the touch of many hands. The windows were dressed with curtains of heavy fabric, drawn closed at night to keep out the drafts that found their way through even the best-fitted panes. Tonight, as on every night, the inn settled into its evening routine with the kind of practiced ease that comes from long repetition. The keeper moved through the space with the economy of motion that characterized those who have performed the same tasks in the same place for many years. He was a man of middle years, neither young nor old, with the quiet competence of someone who understood his work thoroughly and found satisfaction in its proper completion. His evening had begun as evening always began, with the tending of the fire. This was not a task to be rushed or treated carelessly. The fire that burned in the hearth of the common room was more than a source of warmth. It was the heart of the inn, the element that transformed a mere room into a place of gathering and comfort. Throughout the day, it required attention, the addition of coal at regular intervals, the periodic adjustment of the pieces to ensure proper burning, the removal of ash that accumulated in the grate. He had begun by raking forward the embers that remained from the afternoon's fire, arranging them in a careful pattern at the front of the grate. Upon this foundation, he placed pieces of coal, selected for their size and quality, positioned so that the heat from the embers would ignite them gradually. The coal they burned at the inn was not of the finest quality, such luxury was reserved for wealthier establishments, but it was sound, purchased from a merchant in the nearest market town and delivered by cart each month. As the new coal caught and began to burn, he used the poker to adjust its arrangement, creating spaces for air to flow while keeping the pieces close enough that they would support each other's combustion. The fire responded to his attention, the flames growing stronger, the heat beginning to radiate outward into the room. He added more coal, building up the fire to the level that would be appropriate for the evening hours, when the room would fill with the warmth needed to combat the chill that pressed against the windows. This task completed, he turned his attention to the lamps. The inn had gas lighting now, installed some years ago at considerable expense, but the keeper still preferred oil lamps for certain purposes. They provided a softer, more variable light, and their flames required less maintenance than gas fixtures. He moved from lamp to lamp, checking the level of oil in each reservoir, trimming the wicks so they would burn cleanly without smoking, adjusting the glass chimneys to ensure they sat properly in their brass bases. The lamps were distributed throughout the room according to a pattern he had established through experience. One stood on the mantelpiece above the hearth, its light supplementing the glow of the fire. Another occupied a corner of the sideboard where he would work when preparing drinks or managing his accounts. Two more sat on tables in different parts of the room, providing illumination for any guests who might wish to read or converse. Each lamp, when lit, created its own small pool of brightness, and together they filled the room with a light that was warm and golden, inviting rather than harsh. He lit each wick carefully, using a long match struck from the tin he kept for this purpose, adjusting the flame until it burned at the proper height, neither too low so that it would gutter and smoke, nor too high so that it would consume the oil too quickly. The glass chimneys, when properly seated, directed the heat upward and prevented drafts from disturbing the flames. As each lamp was attended to, the room grew brighter, the shadows retreating to the corners and the spaces beneath the furniture. The curtains had already been drawn across the windows, a task he had completed as the daylight faded. They were made of a heavy wool fabric, lined to provide insulation against the cold that radiated from the glass. During the day, they were tied back with simple fabric bands, allowing what light there was to enter the room, but as evening approached, he released them, letting them fall across the windows, shutting out the darkness beyond and containing the warmth within. With the fire burning properly and the lamps lit, he moved to the sideboard to prepare for the evening's trade. The inn did not attract large crowds, not on ordinary nights such as this. The village was small, and most of its residents preferred to remain in their own homes once darkness fell. But there would be a few, he knew, who would make their way to the common room, seeking the warmth and companionship it offered. He checked his stock of beer, drawing a small measure to ensure it was in good condition. The barrel sat in the cool back room, and he had tapped it fresh that morning, a task that required care to avoid disturbing the sediment that settled at the bottom. The beer he served was locally brewed, a dark ale that suited the tastes of the region, neither too bitter nor too sweet. He kept several types of spirits as well, gin and whiskey, though these were less commonly requested. Most of his guests preferred the beer, drinking it slowly from pewter mugs that had been in use at the inn for decades. The mugs themselves required attention. He wiped each one with a clean cloth, checking for any residue from previous use, polishing them until they gleamed dully in the lamplight. They were arranged on a shelf behind the sideboard, ready to be filled when needed. Beside them stood the glasses for spirits, smaller vessels of plain glass, similarly cleaned and ready. His account book lay on the sideboard, a substantial volume bound in dark leather, its pages filled with his careful notation of the inn's business. Each evening, he would record the day's transactions, noting what had been sold, what monies had been received, what expenses had been incurred. The keeping of accurate accounts was not merely a matter of business necessity. It was a point of pride, evidence of his competence and attention to detail. The book represented years of such records, a history of the inn's operations that he maintained with the same care he gave to all aspects of his work. As he prepared the sideboard, arranging everything in its proper place, he became aware of the quality of silence that filled the room. It was not an absolute silence. The fire made its small sounds, the occasional pop of a coal releasing its moisture, the soft settling of pieces as they burned and shifted. The lamps whispered their nearly inaudible song, the faint hiss of burning oil, the almost imperceptible creak of warming glass. Outside, the wind moved against the building, not violently, but with the steady persistence of a late autumn night, finding the small gaps around the windows and doors, making itself known through the slightest draughts that stirred the curtain edges. But beneath these sounds lay a deeper quiet, the quiet of a space that exists primarily for the comfort and accommodation of others, that waits patiently for the arrival of those who will give it purpose through their presence. The inn was never truly empty, even when no guests occupied it. The keeper was there, maintaining it, attending to its needs, ensuring that it remained ready to fulfill its function. Yet there was something in the quality of this waiting that suggested a form of rest, a gathering of resources in preparation for the demands that would inevitably come. He moved to one of the tables and straightened the chairs around it, a small unnecessary action but one that satisfied his sense of order. The chairs had not been moved since he had arranged them that morning, but he checked them nonetheless, ensuring they stood at proper intervals, that their seats were free of dust or debris. At another table, he adjusted the placement of a lamp, moving it a few inches so that its light would fall more evenly across the surface. These small actions, performed without conscious thought, were part of the rhythm of his work, the constant minor adjustments and attentions that kept the inn in its proper state. He knew every board of the floor, every timber of the ceiling, every irregularity in the plastered walls. He knew where drafts entered and how to minimize their effects. He knew which chairs were most comfortable and which tables received the best light. This knowledge, accumulated over years, informed every movement he made, every decision about the placement of furniture or the arrangement of lamps. The evening stretched before him with the particular quality of time that exists in such places, time that is marked not by the rapid succession of events but by the slow, steady progress of familiar routines. He would remain in the common room for some hours yet, available should any guest require his services, tending the fire as it burned down, perhaps reading for a time if the night remained quiet, eventually making his final rounds before retiring to his own quarters above. For now, he settled himself behind the sideboard, not sitting but standing in the relaxed posture of someone comfortable in their place, his hands resting on the worn wood of the surface, his gaze moving across the room with the automatic assessment of someone checking that all was as it should be. The fire burned steadily, its light playing across the hearth stones, the warmth it generated spreading outward in gentle waves. The lamps maintained their faithful glow, creating islands of brightness in the larger space. The curtains hung undisturbed across the windows. The chairs and tables stood in their appointed places. Everything was ready, prepared, waiting for whatever the evening might bring or for the simple continuation of this peaceful state if nothing disturbed it. The inn held its breath, not in anticipation exactly, but in the patient readiness that characterized its existence, night after night, season after season, year following year in the quiet succession of time. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the passing minutes with its measured tick, a sound so constant that it became part of the room's silence rather than an interruption of it. The keeper had wound it that morning, as he did every morning, turning the key with the exact number of rotations required to carry it through the next 24 hours. It was a simple timepiece, its face plain white enamel behind curved glass, its hands black and unadorned. The mechanism made its small sounds, the tick of the escapement, the nearly inaudible whir of the gears, sounds that had become so familiar they registered in his awareness only when something disrupted their rhythm. He moved away from the sideboard and approached the hearth, not because the fire required immediate attention, but because this was part of his routine, the periodic checking that ensured everything continued as it should. The heat met him as he drew near, pressing against his face and hands with its dry warmth. He studied the arrangement of the coals, noting how they burned, which pieces had begun to collapse into ash, which still held their form and heat. With the poker, he made small adjustments, lifting one piece slightly to allow better air flow beneath it, pushing another closer to its neighbors so that their combined heat would maintain the combustion. The poker itself was old, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, its iron shaft bearing the marks of decades of use. When he returned it to its stand beside the hearth, it settled into its accustomed place with the soft click of metal against metal, joining the other implements that waited there. The coal scuttle stood nearby, a simple container of hammered brass that had darkened with age and use. He lifted its lid and examined the contents, noting that he had sufficient coal to last through the evening without needing to fetch more from the storage shed behind the inn. As he straightened, his gaze traveled upward to the mantelpiece, a broad shelf of dark wood that spanned the width of the hearth. Upon it rested the clock, the oil lamp, and several other items that had accumulated there over time. There was a tin that held matches, its surface decorated with a faded image of some pastoral scene. Beside it sat a small wooden box containing the long tapers he used for lighting the lamps when the matches proved insufficient. A brass candlestick stood at one end, holding a half-consumed candle, kept there for emergencies should the lamps fail or additional light be needed. These objects had their places, positions established through habit and convenience, and he noted each one with the automatic inventory of someone who knows his possessions thoroughly. Nothing was out of order, nothing required adjustment or attention. The mantelpiece, like everything else in the room, maintained its quiet readiness, its patient waiting for whatever use might be made of it. He returned to the sideboard and drew out the high stool that stood behind it, settling himself upon its seat with the careful movement of someone whose back had begun to remind him of his years. The stool placed him at a comfortable height for his work, allowing him to survey the room while remaining readily able to attend to any guest who might enter. From this position, he had a clear view of the door, the hearth, and most of the tables and chairs. The lamp beside him provided ample light for reading or writing, should he choose to occupy himself with either activity. His account book lay before him, and he opened it to the current page, reviewing the notations he had made earlier in the day. The entries were written in a careful hand, each line recording a transaction, a purchase of supplies, a payment received, an expenditure for repairs or maintenance. The numbers told the story of the inn's operation, the slow accumulation of small amounts that together constituted his livelihood. There was nothing exceptional in these figures, no sudden windfalls or unexpected expenses, merely the steady progression of ordinary business conducted honestly and recorded faithfully. He had no entries to add at present, the day's trade having been modest and already fully recorded, but he ran his finger down the column of figures nonetheless, checking his arithmetic, ensuring that everything balanced as it should. The act of reviewing the accounts was not strictly necessary at this moment, but it occupied his hands and mind in a way that felt appropriate to the evening's quiet mood. The numbers arranged themselves in their neat columns, speaking of flour purchased and beer sold, of coal delivered and candles consumed, of the countless small transactions that kept the inn functioning from one day to the next. When he had satisfied himself that all was in order, he closed the book and set it aside, returning it to its place at the back of the sideboard. His gaze moved to the row of mugs on their shelf, then to the glasses beside them, then across the room to where the fire continued its steady burning. Everything remained as it had been, as it should be, as it would continue to be for the duration of the evening. The wind outside had strengthened slightly, no longer merely pressing against the building but moving around it with more purpose, seeking entry at every joint and seam. The curtains stirred occasionally, responding to the drafts that found their way through the window frames despite the care with which they had been fitted. The keeper noted this movement without concern. The building was solid, its walls thick, its roof sound. The wind could blow as it wished. The interior would remain protected, the warmth contained, the comfort preserved for anyone who sought it. He rose from his stool and made another circuit of the room, moving from lamp to lamp, checking that each flame burned steadily, that each glass chimney remained properly seated. At the windows, he tested the curtains, ensuring they hung fully closed, their edges overlapping to prevent cold air from penetrating. The fabric was heavy in his hands, substantial, capable of providing the insulation for which it had been chosen. He released each curtain carefully, letting it fall back into place, then moved to the next window to repeat the process. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he walked, familiar sounds that corresponded to particular boards, places where the wood had settled or warped slightly over the decades, creating spots that announced movement with their gentle complaints. He knew each of these sounds, could have navigated the room in complete darkness by their placement alone. They were part of the inn's vocabulary, the language it spoke through its structure and materials, communicating its age and character through these small audible signatures. At one of the tables, he paused to adjust a chair that sat at a slightly awkward angle, pushing it squarely beneath the table's edge. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor, leaving faint marks in the thin layer of dust that accumulated there despite regular sweeping. No space remained perfectly clean, not through any failure of maintenance but simply because dust was a constant presence, arriving on the air, carried in on clothing, settling perpetually in the quiet hours when no one disturbed it. The inn held perhaps 20 people comfortably when full, though it was rarely full except on market days or during special occasions. Most evenings saw a handful of guests at most, local men stopping for a drink and conversation before returning home, the occasional traveler seeking food and shelter for the night. Tonight, if any came at all, they would arrive within the next hour, drawn by the light visible through the gaps around the curtains, the promise of warmth and company that the inn represented against the darkness outside. But for now, in this interval before possible arrival, the room maintained its state of preparation, its atmosphere of readiness without urgency. The keeper settled back onto his stool, his hands resting on the sideboard surface, his posture one of patient attention rather than active anticipation. He had learned long ago that much of the work of keeping an inn consisted not of constant activity but of being present, of maintaining availability, of ensuring that when need arose, he would be ready to meet it promptly and competently. The fire shifted slightly, a piece of coal breaking and settling into a new position, sending up a brief flurry of sparks that danced for a moment before fading. The keeper watched this small event with the mild interest of someone observing a familiar phenomenon, noting it without feeling compelled to take immediate action. The fire would continue to burn for some time yet before requiring additional fuel, and when that time came, he would know it without needing to consult clock or measurement, his experience providing all the information necessary. Above the mantelpiece, the wall bore the marks of many years, small imperfections in the plaster that no amount of maintenance could completely eliminate. There were faint stains where moisture had penetrated at some point in the past, since corrected but leaving their trace. There were slight cracks where the building had settled, creating fine lines that ran in various directions, patterns like the branches of trees or the courses of streams. These marks, like everything else in the inn, told stories of time and use, of the building's life and the care it had received. The keeper's eyes, moving across these familiar surfaces, registered them without particular thought, the way one notes the features of a well-known face, recognizing without analyzing, accepting without questioning. This was his place, these were his surroundings, and their unchanging presence provided a foundation for the rhythm of his work and life. The room in its quiet state was as much a part of his evening as any guest who might arrive, any task he might perform, any conversation he might hold. Time continued its slow advance, marked by the clock's steady ticking, by the gradual consumption of coal in the fire, by the imperceptible burning down of oil in the lamps. The keeper remained at his post behind the sideboard, his breathing slow and even, his gaze resting now on the hearth, now on the door, now on the middle distance where the lamplight created shapes and shadows among the furniture. His thoughts, if he could be said to be thinking at all, moved with the same measured pace as his breathing, touching lightly on matters of supplies to be ordered, repairs to be scheduled, the ordinary concerns that constituted the management of the inn, then drifting away again into a state that was neither quite attention nor quite abstraction but something between the two. The building settled around him with its own small sounds, the soft creak of a beam adjusting to the evening's temperature, the nearly inaudible whisper of air moving through the spaces between walls and floors, the gentle tick and tap of materials responding to the subtle changes in their environment. These sounds, like the visual elements of the room, were so familiar as to pass almost unnoticed, registered by his awareness but requiring no response, no acknowledgement beyond the simple fact of their existence. Outside, in the village beyond the inn's walls, other buildings stood in their own darkness, other hearths burned with their own fires, other people moved through their own evening routines. But here, in this particular space, with its particular arrangement of light and shadow, warmth and waiting, the inn maintained its singular existence, neither part of the village nor separate from it, but occupying its own place in the hierarchy of structures and purposes that made up the community. The keeper shifted slightly on his stool, adjusting his position without rising, his hands moving from the sideboard to rest in his lap for a moment before returning to the wood. The gesture was unconscious, the kind of small movement that the body makes to maintain comfort during periods of stillness. His gaze had settled on the fire again, watching the flames move among the coals, their dance constant yet ever-changing, hypnotic in its combination of pattern and variation. In the coals' red glow, in the lamp's steady illumination, in the clock's patient marking of minutes, in the wind's movement against the windows, in all these elements together, the evening held its particular quality, its sense of time suspended yet progressing, of space both enclosed and infinite, of waiting that was itself a form of fulfillment rather than merely a pause before action. The inn stood ready, the keeper attended, and the night continued its slow advance toward the hours when darkness would be complete and the world would settle into the deeper quiet that preceded dawn. The hearth drew his attention again, though not from any particular need but simply because it was the natural focus of the room, the element to which the eye returned in moments of quietness. The flames had settled into their pattern now, burning with the steady consistency that indicated proper fuel and adequate air. The coals glowed in shades of orange and deep red, their surfaces cracked and fissured like miniature landscapes, each piece gradually transforming from solid matter into heat and ash through the slow process of combustion. He watched this transformation without hurry, his mind registering the progress of the burn, calculating without conscious effort how long the current arrangement would sustain itself before requiring attention. This was knowledge acquired through years of tending fires, an understanding that lived in his hands and eyes rather than in any formal instruction. He knew by the color of the flames whether the fire burned too hot or too cool. He knew by the sound of the coals whether they had sufficient draft or were starved of air. He knew by the quality of the heat reaching his face from across the room whether the fire would carry through the next hour or needed immediate replenishment. For now, it burned well, and he let it be, returning his attention to the room at large. The silence that filled the space was not empty but rather populated by all the small sounds that together created the inn's evening atmosphere. The clock continued its steady measurement. The lamps whispered their nearly inaudible song. The wind moved against the building's exterior with its persistent pressure. The fire made its occasional small adjustments, pieces settling, air moving through the spaces between coals. He became aware of his own breathing, slow and even, matching the measured quality of everything around him. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that required no thought, his body performing its necessary functions while his conscious mind rested in that state of gentle awareness that characterized these quiet hours. His hands lay still upon the sideboard, palms down, fingers relaxed, the wood beneath them smooth and familiar. The room held a particular temperature now, neither too warm nor too cool, the product of the fire's heat balanced against the cold that pressed in from outside. Near the hearth, the air was distinctly warmer, creating a gradient that extended outward across the floor and up toward the ceiling. In the far corners, away from both hearth and lamps, the temperature dropped noticeably, though not to the point of discomfort. The keeper knew these variations intimately, knew where a guest might sit to be warmest, where someone might position themselves if they found the fire too intense, how the heat moved and settled throughout the space. The lamps on their tables and shelf created their own small climates, each generating warmth that rose upward, heating the glass chimneys until they could not be touched without caution. The keeper had learned this as a young man, reaching thoughtlessly to adjust a chimney and receiving a burn that had taught him permanent respect for the heat contained in those glass cylinders. Now his hands moved automatically around the hot surfaces, adjusting wicks and oil levels without ever making contact with the heated glass. Above the hearth, the heat rose most strongly, creating a column of warm air that moved upward to the ceiling and then spread outward, gradually cooling as it dispersed. This movement was invisible but palpable, felt as much as understood, a constant circulation that kept the room's air from becoming stagnant. The keeper had once read, in a periodical borrowed from the vicar, about the science of heat and air movement, about how warm air rises and cool air descends, creating patterns of circulation in enclosed spaces. The article had confirmed what he already knew from experience, giving formal names to phenomena he had observed and worked with for years. He rose from his stool, not because anything required his attention but because sitting for extended periods caused his legs to stiffen, his back to ache. He moved across the room toward the far wall, where a small window looked out onto the side yard. The curtain here was drawn as completely as those at the front, but he pulled it aside slightly, peering out into the darkness beyond the glass. The panes were cold to the touch, their surfaces already beginning to collect moisture on the interior as the warm air of the room met the chill of the glass. Outside, he could see very little. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by the faint suggestion of shapes, the outline of the storage shed, the darker mass of the boundary wall beyond. No lights showed from neighboring buildings. The village at this hour had retired into itself, each household containing its own small circle of light and warmth, leaving the spaces between to darkness and weather. He released the curtain, letting it fall back into place, and turned back to the room. The familiar space welcomed him, its lamp still burning steadily, its fire maintaining its glow, everything as it had been moments before. He made his way to the sideboard again, not hurrying, his footsteps marking their progress across the floor with those small creaks and sounds that mapped his movement through the space. At the sideboard, he opened one of the drawers, removing from it a cloth with which he began to polish the surface of the wood, though it required no polishing, being already clean and cared for. But the action satisfied something in him, the desire to occupy his hands with useful work, however minor. He moved the cloth across the surface in slow, even strokes, feeling the grain of the wood beneath the fabric, noting the places where years of use had worn the finish slightly, creating areas of different texture that his hands could distinguish even without looking. The sideboard itself was a substantial piece, built of oak, with drawers and cupboards that held the various necessities of his trade. In one drawer he kept the cloths for cleaning and polishing. In another, the account books from previous years, their pages filled with the history of the inn's transactions. The cupboards below held reserves of candles, spare lamp wicks, bottles of oil, the accumulated supplies that allowed him to maintain operations without constant trips to merchants and suppliers. He replaced the cloth in its drawer and closed it carefully, the wood sliding smoothly in its grooves, the small brass pull clicking softly as it came to rest. Everything in its place, everything maintained, everything ready for whatever use might be required. This attention to order, this commitment to keeping things properly arranged and cared for, was fundamental to his nature and his work. The inn functioned smoothly because he ensured that it did, through countless small actions performed regularly and thoroughly. The clock on the mantelpiece marked another quarter hour with a single clear chime, the sound carrying through the room and fading slowly into silence. The keeper glanced up at its face, noting the position of the hands, calculating without particular concern how much of the evening remained before he would make his final rounds and retire for the night. Several hours yet, a span of time that felt neither long nor short but simply appropriate to the rhythm of the day. He moved to the nearest table and pulled out one of the chairs, settling himself into it with a quiet sigh. His knees appreciated the change from standing, his back the support of the chair's frame. From this position, he had a different view of the room, lower, more intimate somehow, seeing the space from the perspective of a guest rather than that of the keeper at his post. The fire appeared larger from here, more dominant, its light more immediate. The lamps seemed more scattered, creating distinct pools of brightness rather than the overall illumination they produced when viewed from the sideboard. He let his hands rest on the table's surface, feeling the wood's texture, the slight unevenness where countless meals and drinks had been placed and removed over the years. The table bore these marks without shame, they were evidence of use, of purpose fulfilled, of service rendered to those who had required it. The inn's furniture had never been elegant or fine, but it had always been solid and serviceable, built to withstand the demands placed upon it and to provide reliable comfort to those who used it. His gaze traveled around the room once more, taking in each element, each piece of furniture, each lamp and curtain and corner. This was his domain, his responsibility, his place in the world. Within these walls, he exercised a quiet authority, not through force or assertion but through competence and care, through the steady maintenance of standards and routines that ensured the inn remained a place of refuge and comfort for anyone who entered. The role of innkeeper was not one that commanded great respect or admiration in the wider world. It was not a profession that led to wealth or prominence. But it was honest work, necessary work, and he performed it with a thoroughness that gave him satisfaction. The inn served its purpose, and he enabled that service, and that was sufficient. The fire shifted again, a larger movement this time, several pieces of coal collapsing inward as their structure weakened from burning. A small shower of sparks rose briefly, glowing brightly for a moment before fading and disappearing. The keeper watched this display with the mild interest of someone observing a familiar but never entirely predictable event, then rose from his chair to attend to the fire's needs. He crossed to the hearth, selecting the poker from its stand, and carefully rearranged the coals, redistributing them to create a more stable configuration. The heat rising from the grate was intense on his hands and face, causing him to step back slightly after completing his adjustments. Using the small shovel, he added fresh coal, placing the pieces carefully to build upon the existing fire rather than smothering it. The new coal was cold, its surface dull black, but within minutes the heat would cause it to smoke and then catch, gradually transforming it into the glowing red mass that would sustain the fire for the next hour or more. His work at the hearth complete, he returned the implements to their stand and stepped back, observing his handiwork. The fire would take a few minutes to fully accept the new fuel, to burn away the initial smoke and establish the new coals within its pattern. He could already see the flames beginning to lick at the fresh pieces, could hear the faint hiss as moisture within the coal was driven off by the heat. Satisfied, he turned away from the hearth and made another circuit of the room, checking each lamp, testing each curtain, ensuring that all remained as it should be. This periodic checking was second nature to him now, performed without conscious decision, his body moving through the familiar pattern while his mind rested in that state of gentle watchfulness that characterized his work. At one of the windows, he noticed that a corner of the curtain had become slightly displaced, allowing a thin line of cold air to enter. He adjusted the fabric carefully, overlapping the edges more completely, blocking the draft. The curtain settled back into place, and the small stream of cold air ceased. Another minor correction, another small maintenance task completed, part of the endless succession of tiny adjustments that kept the inn functioning properly. The evening continued its slow progression, each moment following the previous one with quiet inevitability, the room maintaining its state of readiness, the keeper maintaining his vigilant presence, the fire burning, the lamps glowing, the clock ticking, the wind moving against the walls, all the elements combining to create this particular time and place, this specific quality of existence that belonged to the inn on this particular night in the long succession of nights it had witnessed and would continue to witness, season following season, year following year, in the patient continuance of its purpose. The keeper returned to his stool behind the sideboard, settling once more into the position that allowed him to survey the room while remaining unobtrusive in his corner. His hands found their accustomed place on the wood surface, his weight distributed comfortably on the seat. The stool had been with the inn as long as he could remember, its legs slightly uneven now from years of bearing weight, its seat worn to a shallow depression that accommodated his form perfectly. He had never considered replacing it, though newer stools could certainly be purchased. This one served its function adequately, and its very familiarity made it preferable to anything new. From his position, he could observe the way the lamplight fell across the various surfaces of the room, creating patterns of brightness and shadow that shifted slightly as the flames moved within their glass chimneys. The tables nearest the lamps were fully illuminated, there would grain visible, every mark and irregularity revealed in the steady glow. Those farther away receded into softer focus, their edges less distinct, their surfaces suggested rather than clearly defined. The chairs arranged around these more distant tables became shapes rather than objects, their details absorbed into the gentle darkness that the lamps could not fully dispel. The ceiling above, supported by its dark beams, remained mostly in shadow despite the lamp's efforts. Only the area directly above the hearth received much illumination, where the firelight reached upward, playing across the plaster and wood, creating moving patterns as the flames shifted and changed. The rest of the ceiling withdrew into obscurity, its presence felt rather than seen, the upper boundary of the room's enclosed space. He found his gaze drawn once more to the fire, that constant presence that demanded periodic attention yet provided such reliable service in return. The new coals he had added were catching now, their surfaces beginning to glow, smoke rising from them in thin streams that disappeared up the chimney. The fire would burn brighter for a time as these fresh pieces contributed their heat, then settle again into the steady state that would carry it through the next portion of the evening. The warmth from the hearth reached across the room to where he sat, a gentle pressure on his face and hands, noticeable but not overwhelming. In winter, when the cold pressed more insistently against the building, the fire would need to be larger, burning hotter and consuming fuel more rapidly. But on this autumn evening, with the weather merely cool rather than bitter, the moderate fire sufficed, providing comfort without excess. His thoughts, such as they were, moved slowly through the landscape of his responsibilities and concerns. There was flour to be ordered from the mill, a delivery that should arrive within the next few days if the miller kept to his schedule. The thatch on the storage shed had developed a thin spot that would need repair before winter truly set in, though it could wait another week or two if the weather remained dry. One of the upstairs rooms had a window that rattled in strong winds, requiring attention to its fitting or perhaps the addition of some material to dampen the sound. These matters passed through his awareness without urgency, noted and filed away for future action, none requiring immediate response. The inn, for all its age and the constant small maintenance it demanded, remained fundamentally sound. The roof kept out the rain, the walls kept out the cold, the doors and windows functioned as they should. His stewardship, exercised through daily attention and periodic larger efforts, maintained the building in its state of serviceable readiness. He shifted slightly on his stool, easing a point of stiffness in his lower back. The body's complaints grew more frequent with the passing years, small reminders of time's effect on flesh and bone. His hands, resting on the sideboard, bore the marks of his work, calluses in places where tools or implements had pressed repeatedly against the skin, small scars from long-forgotten minor injuries, the general roughness that came from handling coal and wood and metal without gloves or particular care for their preservation. These were working hands, shaped by their labor, and he regarded them without vanity or regret, accepting them as appropriate to his station and occupation. The clock marked another quarter hour with its single chime. The sound entered the room's silence and dispersed, absorbed by the curtains and furniture, fading until only memory held its echo. Time's passage, measured and marked, continued its inexorable advance, carrying the evening forward through the hours toward night's deeper reaches. Yet within the room, the progression felt less like movement than like a series of nearly identical moments, each so similar to the one before that change became almost imperceptible. The keeper rose once more, compelled not by any specific need but by an inclination toward movement, a desire to occupy himself with some small task rather than remain stationary. He approached the cupboard that stood against the far wall, opening its doors to reveal the shelves within. Here were stored the inn's supply of crockery, the plates and bowls used for serving food, the serving dishes and platters, all arranged in neat stacks according to size and purpose. He had no intention of removing anything from the cupboard, but he ran his eyes over the contents nonetheless, performing an inventory, ensuring that all was as it should be. The plates, heavy ceramic with simple decoration around their edges, showed signs of long use but remained serviceable. A few bore small chips at their rims, damage accumulated over years of handling, but nothing that compromised their function. The bowls, similarly sturdy and plain, sat in their stack, ready for use should anyone require soup or stew. On a lower shelf rested the serving dishes, larger vessels used when preparing food for multiple guests. These saw less regular use than the individual plates and bowls, being brought out primarily on busier days when several travelers might dine together. Their surfaces bore scratches from countless servings, but like everything else in the inn, they remained fit for their purpose despite their age and wear. He closed the cupboard doors carefully, ensuring the latch caught properly, then moved to the window nearest that wall. The curtain here hung perfectly still, undisturbed by any draft. He touched the fabric lightly, feeling its texture, its weight, its slight coolness where it hung near the cold glass. The weave was tight and strong, capable of lasting many more years with proper care. When these curtains eventually wore out, as all things must, he would need to find fabric of similar quality to replace them, a task that would require a trip to the market town and negotiation with the draper there. But that time remained distant, a future concern that required no present action. For now, the curtains served admirably, and he let the fabric fall from his fingers, returning to his position behind the sideboard. The room received him back into its quiet embrace, the lamps continuing their steady burning, the fire maintaining its glow, everything proceeding as it had been, as it would continue to be for the duration of the evening. He noticed that the lamp on the sideboard required adjustment, its wick having burned slightly lower than optimal, causing the flame to diminish. He lifted the glass chimney carefully, holding it by its brass fitting to avoid the heated glass, and used the small key attached to the lamp's base to raise the wick slightly. The flame brightened immediately, growing taller and more vigorous, casting stronger light across his work area. He replaced the chimney, ensuring it seated properly, then stood back to observe the result. The adjustment had been minor but effective, restoring the lamp to its proper brightness. Such small corrections formed the texture of his work, countless tiny interventions that maintained the inn's function and comfort. None were dramatic or impressive, but together they constituted the difference between a space that operated smoothly and one that fell gradually into disrepair and disorder. The keeper understood this instinctively, his attention to these details not a matter of conscious virtue but simply the way he approached his responsibilities. His gaze moved to the account book, still resting where he had placed it earlier. He drew it toward him again, opening it not to make entries but simply to review what had been recorded, to refresh his memory of recent transactions and remind himself of upcoming obligations. The pages spoke of routine business, nothing exceptional or noteworthy, the ordinary flow of commerce that sustained the inn from week to week and month to month. He noted that payment would soon be due to the coal merchant, a substantial sum that represented his largest regular expense aside from the rent he paid to the inn's owner, a gentleman farmer who lived several miles distant and visited only occasionally to collect what was owed. The rent was reasonable, reflecting both the inn's modest size and the owner's recognition that excessive demands would make the property difficult to let. The keeper had occupied the inn for more than a decade now, the arrangement proving satisfactory to both parties, neither seeking to alter terms that worked adequately for their respective purposes. Closing the account book once more, he replaced it in its position and let his hands rest again on the sideboard's surface. The wood was smooth and cool beneath his palms, a familiar sensation that carried associations of countless previous evenings spent in this same position, performing these same actions, maintaining these same routines. There was comfort in this repetition, a sense of rightness that came from knowing his place and fulfilling its requirements competently. The fire had settled into its new configuration, the added coals now burning as steadily as those that had been there longer. The flames moved among them with their characteristic dance, never still, never quite repeating their patterns, yet maintaining an overall consistency that spoke of proper combustion and adequate fuel. The heat radiating from the hearth continued its gradual spread through the room, maintaining the temperature at its comfortable level, neither too warm nor too cool for the season and circumstances. Outside, the wind maintained its steady pressure against the building, occasionally gusting slightly stronger, making itself known through the small sounds of stressed timbers and rattled fittings, then subsiding again to its baseline presence. The village beyond the inn's walls remained invisible in the darkness, its existence confirmed only by the keeper's knowledge that it was there, the familiar landscape hidden now by night and weather. Within the room, the lamps burned on, consuming their oil at the steady rate that would allow them to last through the evening and into the night if necessary. Each wick drew fuel from its reservoir through the slow action of capillary forces, presenting it to the flame where heat transformed liquid into vapor and then into light and warmth. The process was constant, reliable, requiring no intervention beyond the periodic adjustments that kept the wicks at their proper height and the reservoirs adequately filled. The keeper's breathing had fallen into rhythm with the room's quiet pulse, slow and even, his chest rising and falling in a pattern that matched the measured pace of everything around him. His eyes, though open and attentive, had softened their focus, seeing the room as a whole rather than examining individual elements, taking in the complete scene of lamplight and shadow, warmth and waiting, the familiar space that constituted his domain and responsibility. Time continued its advancement, marked by the clock, reflected in the fire's gradual consumption of its fuel, evident in the slow descent of oil levels in the lamps, measured in the imperceptible accumulation of ash beneath the grate. Each moment gave way to the next in seamless succession, the evening progressing through its appointed span toward the later hours when the keeper would make his final rounds, ensure all was secure, and retire to his quarters above, leaving the inn to its nighttime silence until morning brought the return of light and activity. The keeper became aware of a slight change in the fire's sound, a softer crackling that indicated the coals had burned down sufficiently to warrant his attention once more. He rose from his stool with the slow deliberation of someone whose movements had settled into a rhythm determined by necessity rather than haste. His approach to the hearth was unhurried, his steps marking their familiar path across the floor, the boards responding with their customary creaks in the places he knew they would sound. Standing before the grate, he assessed the fire's condition with the practiced eye of long experience. The coals had indeed diminished, their glow less intense than it had been, though still sufficient for the moment. He took up the poker and worked among them carefully, consolidating the remaining heat, drawing the live coals toward the center where they could support each other's combustion. Small pieces of ash fell through the grate as he worked, adding to the accumulation in the pan beneath, a pan that would need emptying in the morning before the day's first fire was laid. He added coal again, selecting pieces of moderate size, arranging them with care to build upon the foundation he had prepared. The new fuel would take time to catch, going through its initial smoking stage before the flames properly claimed it. He had learned long ago not to add too much at once, which would smother the fire, nor too little, which would allow it to die back too far before recovery. The proper amount, placed properly, would maintain the fire's continuity while allowing it to grow gradually to the strength required for the next interval. The poker returned to its stand with the familiar ring of iron on iron. He remained at the hearth for a moment longer, watching the fire's response to his ministrations, ensuring that it accepted the new fuel as it should. Smoke rose from the fresh coals, gray tendrils that climbed toward the chimney's throat and disappeared into the darkness there. Soon the smoke would lessen as the coal's volatile elements burned away, leaving the pure carbon to glow and provide heat. Satisfied, he turned from the hearth and moved toward the far end of the room, where the narrow staircase led to the upper floor. He placed his hand on the banister, not to ascend but simply from habit, his fingers finding the groove worn smooth by countless previous touches. The staircase rose steeply, its treads narrow, designed for a time when space was precious and stairs were purely functional rather than features to be displayed or admired. During the day, light from a small window at the landing provided illumination, but at this hour the stairs disappeared into shadow above the third or fourth step, the upper reaches invisible from below. He had no reason to climb the stairs at present. The sleeping rooms above were prepared for guests should any arrive requiring accommodation, their beds made with clean linens, their wash basins filled with water, their chamber pots emptied and cleaned. This preparation had been completed that morning, part of the daily routine that ensured the inn remained ready to fulfill its function regardless of whether anyone actually made use of its facilities. Many days passed when no one required a room, yet the rooms were prepared nonetheless, maintained in their state of readiness against the possibility of need. Releasing the banister, he made his way back across the room, pausing at one of the tables to adjust a chair that had somehow shifted from its proper alignment. The chair's position had not been dramatically wrong, merely slightly irregular, but his eye had caught the deviation and his hands moved automatically to correct it. The chair legs scraped softly as he pushed it into place, the sound brief and quickly absorbed into the room's ambient quiet. At the window beside this table, he checked the curtain once more, a repeated action that served no practical purpose but satisfied some need for thoroughness in his nature. The fabric hung properly, its folds even, its edges overlapping to prevent drafts. Yet he touched it anyway, his hand confirming what his eyes had already verified, the gesture more ritual than necessity, part of the continuous round of checking and adjusting that constituted his evening's work. The lamp on this table burned with a steady flame, its light falling across the wood surface in a circle of brightness that faded gradually toward the edges. He studied the lamp for a moment, noting the oil level in its reservoir, calculating without conscious arithmetic how many more hours it would burn before requiring refilling. Several hours remained, more than sufficient for the evening's needs. In the morning, he would refill all the lamps, a task performed daily to ensure none ran dry unexpectedly during use. His circuit of the room complete, he returned once more to the sideboard, resuming his position behind it, his hands finding their accustomed place on the worn wood. The stool received his weight with its familiar slight give, the legs settling into the depressions they had worn in the floor over years of bearing the same burden in the same location. Everything returned to its previous state, the room and its keeper waiting together in their shared quietness. The clock's tick continued its steady measurement, each sound identical to the one before, yet each marking the passage of another moment, another small increment in time's forward progress. The keeper had long since ceased to hear the ticking as a distinct sound, it had become part of the room's silence, noticed only when it stopped during the weekly winding or when some other sound momentarily drew attention to it through contrast. Yet it performed its function nonetheless, marking the hours and their divisions with mechanical precision, indifferent to whether anyone paid attention to its pronouncements. He found himself thinking about the building's age, a subject that occasionally occupied his mind during these quiet hours. The inn had stood in its location for longer than living memory could account for, its construction dating to a time before current records began. The stone of its walls bore the marks of generations, slight hollows where rainwater had run along the same paths for decades, subtle wearing where the corners had been rubbed by the passage of carts and wagons, the general softening of edges that stone undergoes when exposed to weather and time. Within, the beams that supported the ceiling showed similar evidence of age, their surfaces darkened not by stain but by the slow accumulation of smoke from countless fires, their wood hardened and strengthened by decades of bearing weight. The floor beneath his feet, though regularly scrubbed and maintained, carried the marks of uncountable footsteps, places where the wood had compressed under repeated pressure, creating subtle paths and patterns that mapped the room's most frequent routes of travel. This aging was not decay but rather a kind of maturation, the building settling into itself, its materials adapting to their purposes, finding their equilibrium with the forces that acted upon them. The inn was not pristine, would never be pristine again, but it was sound, its structure solid, its function unimpaired by the years it had witnessed. In this way, it resembled the furniture and implements it contained, none perfect, all serviceable, everything bearing the honest marks of use and time. The keeper's own relationship with the inn had developed similar qualities over his years of occupancy. He had arrived as a younger man, taking over the keeping from the previous tenant whose health had failed, learning the building's particulars through experience rather than instruction. In the beginning, he had approached his duties with the conscious attention of someone mastering new tasks, thinking through each action, deliberating over decisions, uncertain of many things. Now, after more than a decade, the work had become instinctive, his body and mind moving through the routines without need for conscious direction. He knew which floorboards creaked and which did not, knew which windows sealed tightly and which admitted slight drafts, knew how much coal the fire required and when it required it, knew where to place the lamps for optimal light and which chairs were most comfortable and which tables stood most stably. This knowledge lived in him without conscious recollection, emerging naturally as circumstances demanded its application. The fire shifted again, a small adjustment as the coals settled, and he glanced toward it automatically, his attention drawn by the sound, his eyes assessing the situation without any intervening thought between perception and judgment. The fire was well, burning as it should, requiring no immediate intervention. His gaze returned to the middle distance, his mind settling back into its state of gentle watchfulness. Outside, the wind had diminished slightly, no longer pressing quite so insistently against the building, though it maintained its presence as a background force, a reminder of the weather beyond the walls. The curtains hung more quietly now, their edges less troubled by drafts, their stillness contributing to the room's overall sense of calm. The storm, if it could be called that, had perhaps passed its peak, now subsiding into the ordinary breezes of an autumn night. The keeper reflected, in his unhurried way, on how many such evenings he had experienced in this room, how many times he had stood or sat in these same positions, tending these same fires, checking these same lamps, waiting in this same patient manner for whatever might or might not occur. The evenings blended together in his memory, distinguishable only by unusual incidents or particular guests, the vast majority merging into a continuous experience of routine and repetition. Yet this sameness did not breed dissatisfaction or restlessness in him. Rather, it provided a kind of comfort, a sense of knowing his place and fulfilling its requirements, of being adequate to the demands made upon him, of serving a function that, while modest, was nonetheless legitimate and necessary. The world required inns, required places where travelers could find shelter and locals could gather, and he provided such a place with competence and care. This was sufficient. His hands, still resting on the sideboard, had grown slightly cool, the warmth of his body insufficient to counter the mild chill of the wood. He rubbed them together briefly, generating slight friction, then returned them to their position. The coolness was not uncomfortable, merely noticeable, a small sensation among the many that constituted his physical experience of the room and the evening. The lamps continued their quiet burning, their flames moving slightly in response to air currents too subtle for direct perception, creating gentle variations in the light they cast, making the shadows shift and breathe in ways that suggested movement where no movement actually occurred. The keeper watched these effects without particular focus, his eyes registering the play of light and shadow without his mind analyzing or categorizing what they saw. Time advanced through another increment, the clock marking a quarter hour with its single clear chime, the sound entering the stillness and dispersing as it had before, leaving behind only the resumed ticking that measured the smaller divisions of minutes and seconds. The evening continued its progression, neither hastening nor delaying, moving at the pace that evenings move, carrying all within it forward through the hours toward the night's deeper reaches and the eventual approach of dawn. The keeper shifted his weight on the stool, easing the pressure on one hip, a small adjustment that brought momentary relief to muscles that had begun to stiffen from prolonged sitting. His body made its quiet complaints, the inevitable protests of flesh that had been held in one position for an extended period, and he acknowledged these sensations without giving them particular importance. They were simply part of the experience of being present, of maintaining his post through the evening's duration. He reached beneath the sideboard and withdrew a clean cloth, beginning to wipe down the surface once more, though it required no wiping, being already clean from his earlier attention. But the action occupied his hands in a way that felt purposeful, gave him something tangible to do during this interval of waiting. The cloth moved across the wood in slow, methodical strokes, covering the same area repeatedly, creating no visible change in the surface but satisfying nonetheless in its execution. The repetitive motion freed his mind to wander through thoughts that had no particular urgency or direction, observations about the inn's operations, memories of previous seasons, considerations of tasks that would need attention in the coming weeks. These thoughts arose and subsided without his conscious summoning, drifting through his awareness like clouds moving across an empty sky, casting their brief shadows before passing on. He thought about the supply of candles, kept in one of the sideboard's lower cupboards, and made a mental note to count them soon, to determine whether an order should be placed with the chandler in the market town. Candles were less frequently used now that the lamps provided primary lighting, but they remained necessary for certain purposes, for carrying light when moving between rooms, for providing illumination during lamp maintenance, for occasions when additional light was required beyond what the fixed lamps could provide. His mind moved from candles to the question of firewood, which supplemented the coal during the coldest months, providing quick heat when the fire needed encouragement or when cooking required a hotter, more immediate flame than coal could readily provide. The woodshed behind the inn held a modest supply, but winter would require more, and arrangements should be made with the farmer who typically supplied the inn's wood, cut and split to appropriate sizes, delivered by cart in quantities that would last through the season's demands. These practical considerations occupied a portion of his thoughts, but only a portion, the remainder resting in that state of quiet attention that characterized his evenings, aware without focusing, present without striving, simply existing within the room and the time, fulfilling his function through his availability rather than through constant activity. The keeper's role, he had learned, consisted as much of being present as of doing specific tasks, of maintaining readiness rather than perpetual motion. He folded the cloth and returned it to its place beneath the sideboard, his hands then returning to rest on the surface, resuming their position as though drawn there by habit's gravity. The wood felt familiar beneath his palms, its temperature, its texture, its slight irregularities all known to him through countless previous contacts. This piece of furniture, like everything else in the inn, had become an extension of himself through long association, so thoroughly incorporated into his daily existence that he could hardly imagine the room without it or his work without its solid presence. The fire had accepted the coal he had added earlier, the fresh pieces now glowing alongside the older coals, contributing their heat to the room's warming. The flames had diminished slightly from their earlier vigor but maintained adequate strength, burning with the steady consistency that indicated good combustion. He judged, from the fire's appearance and his internal sense of time's passage, that it would require no further attention for at least another hour, perhaps longer if the evening remained quiet and he made no movements that disturbed the air significantly. Above the mantelpiece, the clock continued its patient work, its mechanism performing the countless small operations required to maintain accurate time, gears turning, escapements releasing, the pendulum swinging in its arc, all the intricate mechanical movements hidden within the case, visible only in their result, the steady advancement of the hands across the numbered face. The keeper glanced at it occasionally but did not consult it with any urgency, time-specific measurement being less important than his general sense of the evening's progress. The lamps, too, continued their reliable service, each flame burning at its appointed height, each glass chimney containing and directing the heat upward, each brass base holding steady on its surface. The light they provided had become so constant, so expected, that it registered in his awareness more through its effects than through the lamps themselves, noticed in the way it revealed surfaces and textures, created visibility and shadow, defined the room's dimensions and features. The lamps were simply there, performing their function, requiring no acknowledgement beyond the periodic maintenance that kept them operating properly. His gaze traveled once more around the room, following a path it had traced countless times before, moving from the hearth to the nearest table, then to the window beside it, across to the far wall with its cupboard and additional tables, back toward the door that remained closed against the night, completing the circuit at the sideboard where he sat. Each element of the room presented itself to his vision as it always did, unchanged, familiar, existing in its appointed place, fulfilling its designated purpose. The chairs stood around their tables in arrangements that balanced function with appearance, close enough to the tables to be clearly associated with them, far enough back to allow easy access when someone wished to sit. Some of the chairs were drawn slightly closer, adjusted by previous guests and not yet returned to their standard positions, but these small variations did not trouble him. They would be corrected in the morning during his daily ordering of the room, or perhaps later tonight if he made another circuit before retiring. The curtains hung in their heavy folds, blocking the cold glass of the windows, containing the room's warmth, shutting out the darkness that pressed against the building's exterior. Their fabric showed signs of age in places, slight thinning where sunlight had struck them most directly during countless days, minor fraying at edges that had rubbed against window frames when being opened and closed. But they remained serviceable, capable of performing their function for some time yet before replacement became necessary. The floor stretched across the room in its expanse of worn boards, each plank bearing its own history of use, its own pattern of marks and stains, its own contribution to the surface across which the inn's occupants moved in their various purposes. Some boards were darker than others, stained by spills that had penetrated the wood despite cleaning efforts. Some showed lighter patches where heavy furniture had protected them from the darkening effects of time and traffic. Together they formed the foundation upon which everything else rested, the base that supported furniture and occupants alike. The ceiling above remained mostly in shadow despite the lamp's efforts, its beams visible primarily where the firelight reached upward, casting moving patterns across the old wood. During daylight hours, when sun entered through the windows, the ceiling revealed itself more completely, showing the construction methods of an earlier time, the way the beams had been shaped and joined, the manner in which they supported the structure above. But at night, with only lamps and fire for illumination, the ceiling receded into obscurity, acknowledged but not clearly seen, present but not prominent. The keeper became aware of his breathing again, slow and steady, the automatic function of his lungs continuing without conscious direction, drawing air in and expelling it in the rhythm that sustained life. The air in the room was neither fresh nor stale but somewhere between, warmed by the fire, carrying the slight scent of burning coal, the faint smell of lamp oil, the subtle odors that accumulated in any enclosed space occupied by human activity. These smells were so familiar that he rarely noticed them consciously, they formed part of the inn's character, contributing to its particular atmosphere. His back had begun to ache slightly from sitting, a dull discomfort that suggested he should stand and move about soon, allowing his muscles to stretch and his joints to shift positions. But he remained seated for the moment, not from any unwillingness to move but simply from the inertia that comes with being settled, the body's resistance to changing states even when such change would bring relief. He would rise soon, make another circuit of the room, tend to the fire again, but for now he remained where he was, his hands on the sideboard, his weight on the stool, his presence steady in the lamplight. The wind outside had diminished further, now barely perceptible except during occasional gusts that reminded those within of its continued existence. The storm, if it had ever truly been a storm, had passed, leaving behind only the ordinary movement of air that characterized any autumn night. The building no longer creaked and settled in response to external pressures but maintained its quiet presence, solid and unmoved, sheltering those within from whatever weather moved across the darkened landscape beyond its walls. Within this shelter, the evening continued its slow unfolding, each moment leading seamlessly to the next, time advancing at its measured pace toward the later hours when the keeper would eventually make his preparations for night, when the fire would be banked rather than maintained, when the lamps would be extinguished except for one kept burning low to provide minimal light, when the inn would be secured and left to its nocturnal silence until morning returned with its renewal of activity and light. But that time remained distant yet, perhaps 2 hours away, perhaps more, depending on various factors that the keeper would assess as the evening progressed. For now, the room maintained its state of readiness, the fire burned, the lamps glowed, and the keeper kept his watch, fulfilling his function through his patient presence, serving his purpose through his steady availability, occupying his place in the small world the inn constituted, a world complete unto itself within these walls, sufficient in its modest purpose, adequate in its simple provisions. The clock marked another quarter hour, its chime brief and clear, immediately absorbed into the silence that followed. The keeper heard it without reaction, noted it without response, simply registering time's passage as the clock's mechanism intended, then allowing his awareness to return to its previous state of gentle watchfulness, present but not pressing, attentive but not tense, maintaining that particular quality of consciousness that his work required, neither fully alert nor approaching sleep, but occupying the middle ground that allowed him to remain at his post hour after hour without either exhausting his attention or losing his readiness to respond should response be required. The room held him in its familiar embrace, known and knowing, a space so thoroughly incorporated into his existence that he could barely distinguish where his identity ended and its atmosphere began, keeper and inn merged through long association into a single entity that functioned according to routines established through years of practice, maintaining itself through the patient continuation of tasks performed regularly and thoroughly, existing in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one's purpose and fulfilling it adequately, serving without drama or distinction, but serving nonetheless, providing shelter and warmth and welcome to any who required it, maintaining readiness against possibilities that might or might not materialize, waiting with neither impatience nor concern, simply being present, simply continuing, simply existing in the slow passage of evening hours. The keeper finally rose from his stool, prompted by the increasing stiffness in his lower back and the sense that movement would serve him better than continued sitting. He straightened slowly, feeling his spine adjust to the vertical position, the small pops and creaks that accompanied the change in posture. His legs accepted his weight without difficulty, though they too carried the slight numbness that came from prolonged immobility. He stood for a moment beside the sideboard, allowing his body to fully transition from seated to standing, before beginning another circuit of the room. His first destination was the hearth, where the fire required assessment if not yet intervention. He approached the warmth with his customary deliberate pace, his eyes studying the coals' arrangement, their color, the pattern of flames that moved among them. The fire had burned down somewhat since his last attention, though not critically. The coals still glowed with adequate heat, still provided warmth to the room, but they had begun to separate slightly as their substance diminished, creating gaps that would eventually cause the fire to lose its coherence if not addressed. He took up the poker once more, that familiar weight of iron in his hand, and worked among the coals with practiced efficiency, drawing them back together, consolidating their heat, preparing them to receive fresh fuel. The task required neither haste nor extensive effort, merely the correct application of knowledge gained through countless previous repetitions. Each movement of the poker had its purpose, each adjustment its reason, the work proceeding according to principles he understood without needing to articulate them. Fresh coal was added, pieces selected for size and placement with the same care he always employed, arranged to build upon the existing fire rather than overwhelming it. The new fuel sat black and cold among the glowing coals, an intrusion that would gradually be transformed through heat's action, smoke giving way to flame, flame giving way to the steady glow of sustained combustion. He observed the beginning of this process, ensuring the fire accepted the new coal properly, then returned the poker to its stand and stepped back from the intense heat. The warmth had brought slight moisture to his forehead, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, a gesture automatic and unremarked. The fire would manage itself now for some time, the fuel adequate for the next interval, the arrangement sound. His attention turned to other matters, his feet carrying him across the room toward the window he had checked earlier but felt compelled to check again, that persistent thoroughness that characterized his approach to his responsibilities. The curtain hung as it should, undisturbed since his previous adjustment, but he touched it nonetheless, his fingers confirming what his eyes had already observed. Beyond the glass, the night remained complete, impenetrable, offering no view of the world outside. The pane was cold beneath his fingertips when he touched it briefly, testing the temperature, gauging how much heat the building lost through these points of contact between interior and exterior. The glass was not particularly thick, the windows being of older construction before modern techniques had made such improvements common, and cold radiated from it despite the curtain's protective presence. He released the curtain and moved on, his circuit taking him past several tables, each receiving his brief attention, his eyes noting their condition, their cleanliness, the arrangement of chairs around them. At one table, he paused to brush away a small accumulation of dust that had settled on the surface, though where the dust had come from he could not say, as he had cleaned these tables thoroughly that morning. But dust was persistent, arriving from nowhere and everywhere, settling constantly despite all efforts to keep it at bay. He brushed it onto the floor where it would be swept up tomorrow, another small task in the endless succession of small tasks that maintained the inn standards. The lamps drew his attention next, each one examined to ensure its continued proper function. The first he reached burned well, its flame steady, its chimney clean, its oil reservoir still adequately filled. The second showed similar soundness. The third, however, had begun to smoke slightly, a thin dark line rising from the flame and discoloring the interior of the glass chimney. He lifted the chimney carefully, set it aside, and adjusted the wick, lowering it just enough to eliminate the smoke while maintaining adequate light. The adjustment made, he replaced the chimney and observed the result, satisfied when the smoke ceased and the flame burned cleanly again. These periodic checks prevented problems before they developed, catching small deviations before they became significant issues. A smoking lamp left unattended would gradually blacken its chimney, reducing the light it provided and requiring more extensive cleaning later. Better to adjust it now, when the correction required only a moment's attention. This preventive approach to maintenance characterized his stewardship, addressing small matters promptly rather than allowing them to accumulate into larger difficulties. His circuit complete, he found himself near the door, that solid barrier between the inn's interior and the night beyond. The door was firmly closed, its bolt thrown, securing the building against casual entry. During the day, when the inn was open for business, the door stood unbolted, ready to admit anyone who approached. But at this hour, with the evening well advanced and no guests having arrived, he had secured it earlier, though he could not recall the exact moment when he had done so, the action being so routine as to leave no distinct memory. He placed his hand against the door's wooden surface, feeling its solidity, its thickness, the barrier it represented. The wood was cool but not cold, protected from the external temperature by its mass and construction. Beyond it lay the street, the village, the wider world of fields and roads and distant towns, all invisible now in darkness, existing only in his knowledge and imagination. The inn stood as an island in this darkness, self-contained, sufficient, its interior warmth and light isolated from the vast cold night that surrounded it. Turning from the door, he made his way back toward the sideboard, but rather than resuming his seat behind it, he moved instead to one of the tables and pulled out a chair, settling into it with a slight sigh. The change in position felt beneficial, allowing different muscles to bear his weight, providing his back with the support of the chair's frame rather than requiring it to maintain an upright position through its own effort. He stretched his legs out beneath the table, easing the tension in his knees, allowing his body to relax into the chair's embrace. From this new vantage point, the room appeared slightly different, the perspectives altered by the change in his location. The fire, now viewed from farther away and a different angle, seemed smaller, less dominant, though its warmth still reached him across the intervening space. The lamps created different patterns of light and shadow from this position, their illumination falling across surfaces he did not usually observe so directly. The sideboard, from which he normally viewed the room, now stood before him as an object rather than his workstation, its solid presence just another piece of the inn's furniture. He rested his hands on the table's surface, feeling the wood's texture, the accumulated marks of use that gave it character. His fingers traced idly over a small gouge near the edge, a defect that must have occurred years ago, the circumstances of its creation long forgotten, now simply part of the table's history. The wood had been rubbed smooth around the gouge by subsequent handling, the sharp edges worn away, incorporating the damage into the table's overall surface through the slow action of countless touches. His gaze rose to the ceiling beams, more visible from this seated position than when he stood behind the sideboard. The wood was dark with age and smoke, its grain barely discernible in the dim light that reached these upper regions. The beams spanned the room's width with reassuring solidity, their massive presence a reminder of the building's strength, its ability to endure through decades of bearing weight and weather. No sag was visible in their straight lines, no sign of weakness or failure, merely the darkening that came from years of exposure to the smoke that inevitably rose from the hearth despite the chimney's best efforts to draw it away. The room's silence pressed gently against his ears, not an absolute absence of sound but rather the quietness that results from the absence of voices, of movement, of the various noises that accompany human activity. The fire's small sounds continued, the clock maintained its ticking, the wind made its minimal presence known, but these were background elements, the constant notes against which other sounds would be measured if they occurred. In their absence, the room rested in a state of acoustic calm, undisturbed by anything more significant than its own small internal activities. The keeper's thoughts, moving through this quietness, turned to considerations of the season, the gradual transition from autumn toward winter that was proceeding according to its inevitable schedule. The days had been growing shorter, the angle of sunlight lower, the morning chill more persistent. Soon the first frost would arrive if it had not already done so in the fields beyond the village. The trees that lined the road to the market town would lose their remaining leaves, standing bare through the cold months until spring's return prompted their renewal. These seasonal progressions were as familiar to him as the routines of the inn, cycles that repeated annually, marking time's passage in ways more obvious than the clock's steady ticking. Each season brought its particular demands and adjustments. Winter would require larger fires, more coal, attention to drafts and cold spots. Spring would bring dampness and the need for additional cleaning as mud was tracked in on boots. Summer's heat would make the fire less welcome, its warmth excessive rather than comforting. Autumn, like the present moment, occupied the middle ground, requiring warmth but not yet the full measures needed for deep winter. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his position slightly, seeking the most comfortable arrangement of his body against the wood. The chair was not designed for extended sitting, its straight back and hard seat more suitable for brief occupancy during meals or drinks than for prolonged rest. Yet it served adequately for his current purpose, providing support and a different perspective from his usual position behind the sideboard. He would not remain here long, would soon return to his customary post, but for now this temporary relocation satisfied his need for variation within the evening's routine. The fire crackled softly, a piece of coal splitting under heat's influence, the sound sharp but brief, immediately swallowed by the surrounding quiet. The keeper glanced toward the hearth automatically, his trained attention responsive to any sound from that quarter, but the fire required nothing from him, the split coals settling into a new configuration without disrupting the overall burn. His gaze returned to the middle distance, his mind resuming its gentle drift through thoughts that required no particular resolution or action. Time advanced through another of its measured increments, the clock's chime marking the quarter hour with its single clear note, a sound that had become so familiar through repetition that it barely registered in his conscious awareness, noted and immediately filed away, serving its purpose of marking time's passage without demanding attention or response. The evening progressed toward its eventual conclusion, though that conclusion remained hours distant, beyond multiple repetitions of the routines that structured the keeper's night, beyond several more additions of coal to the fire, beyond the gradual dimming and eventual extinguishing of some of the lamps, beyond decisions not yet made about when precisely to begin the preparations for retiring. The keeper remained in his chair for some minutes longer, his body appreciating the respite from standing, his mind continuing its unhurried movement through various considerations that required no immediate resolution. He thought briefly about the morning's tasks, the sweeping and cleaning that would need to be done, the breakfast preparations if any guests remained from the night before, though none had arrived thus far and he did not particularly expect any at this late hour. The inn's guest rooms stood empty and waiting above, their silence undisturbed, their readiness unrequired. Eventually, he rose from the chair, the imperative to return to his proper station asserting itself through habit rather than necessity. His body protested mildly at the renewed movement, joints stiff from sitting in one position, but he straightened and made his way back toward the sideboard with his characteristic unhurried gait. The stool behind the sideboard received him back into its familiar contours, his weight settling into the depression worn by years of previous occupancy, his hands finding their accustomed place on the wood's surface. From this resumed position, he surveyed the room once more, noting that nothing had changed during his brief absence, everything remaining as it had been, as it should be. The fire burned steadily, the lamps maintained their glow, the curtains hung undisturbed, the furniture stood in its appointed places. The room existed in its state of perpetual readiness, waiting patiently for whatever might or might not occur, content in its function whether that function was actively employed or merely held in reserve. He drew his account book toward him again, not to make entries but simply from a desire to occupy his hands with something familiar. The leather cover was cool and smooth under his fingers, worn to softness by handling. He opened the book to a page several months previous, examining entries from the summer when trade had been somewhat more brisk, when travelers moved more frequently along the roads and the weather made evening gatherings more appealing. The numbers told their story of modest success, nothing remarkable but steady, reliable, the kind of business that sustained the inn without bringing either prosperity or hardship. Comparing those summer figures mentally with the current season's receipts, he noted the expected decline, the reduction in custom that came naturally as days shortened and weather discouraged unnecessary travel. This pattern repeated annually, as predictable as the seasons themselves, requiring no particular concern or response beyond the adjustments he made automatically to his ordering of supplies and management of expenses. The inn would carry through the winter on reduced income, emerging in spring to gradually build back toward summer's modest peak, the cycle continuing as it always had, as it presumably always would. He closed the account book and returned it to its place, his brief consultation with the past complete, offering neither revelation nor surprise, merely confirmation of patterns already known and understood. The present moment resumed its claim on his attention, the room reasserting itself as the primary reality, the numbers in the ledger fading back into abstraction, important in their way but less immediate than the fire that required tending, the lamps that needed monitoring, the countless small tasks that constituted his actual work. The temperature in the room had stabilized at a comfortable level, neither too warm nor too cool, the fire's output balanced against the cold infiltration from outside. Near the hearth, warmth predominated, creating a zone of enhanced comfort that would be welcome on a truly cold night. Farther from the fire, the temperature dropped perceptibly but remained adequate, the room's overall warmth sufficient for anyone present. In the corners farthest from hearth and lamps, coolness gathered more noticeably, but these areas were not occupied, their slightly lower temperature inconsequential to the room's function. The keeper became aware of a slight hunger, his body reminding him that the evening meal he had eaten some hours earlier had been digested and his stomach anticipated replenishment. But the sensation was mild, easily ignored, and he felt no inclination to leave his post to seek food. A cup of tea would be welcome, perhaps, though the effort required to prepare it seemed disproportionate to the desire. He would manage well enough until he retired for the night, at which point he might have a bit of bread and cheese if hunger persisted, though often he simply went to bed, allowing sleep to carry him through until morning's proper breakfast. These considerations of bodily needs passed through his mind without urgency, noted and filed away, his attention remaining primarily on the room and its maintenance. The keeper's function took precedence over personal comfort, his presence at his post valued more highly than the satisfaction of minor physical wants. This prioritization was so ingrained in his nature that he barely recognized it as a choice, it simply was the way he conducted himself, the standard by which he measured his performance of duty. The wind outside had nearly ceased its movement, the earlier activity having dissipated into the calm that often followed autumn storms. The building no longer experienced any external pressure, no longer responded with small sounds to forces pressing against it. The inn stood in silence, both within and without, its structure undisturbed, its occupant maintaining his quiet vigil. The night had settled into its deepest stillness, that quality of profound quiet that characterizes the hours when most creatures sleep and activity reduces to its minimum. Within this stillness, the clock's ticking became more noticeable, its mechanical precision the only regular sound that marked time's passage. The keeper found his attention drawn to it periodically, his ears picking out the individual ticks from the general quiet, following their succession for several moments before his attention drifted elsewhere. The sound was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, neither welcome nor unwelcome, simply present, fulfilling its function of marking seconds and minutes with mechanical reliability. His gaze traveled to the mantelpiece, where the clock sat among the other objects that occupied that space. The brass candlestick gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its surface catching and reflecting the illumination despite the layer of dust that inevitably accumulated on all surfaces. Beside it, the small wooden box that held the long tapers sat with its lid closed, its contents unseen but known. The tin of matches bore its faded decoration, the pastoral scene barely visible now after years of handling. These objects had their places, their purposes, their small roles in the inn's operation. His hands on the sideboard had grown slightly cool again, the wood's temperature lower than his body's warmth, drawing heat away through constant contact. He rubbed his palms together briefly, generating friction, then returned them to the surface. The coolness was not uncomfortable, merely noticeable, a small sensation among the many that constituted his physical experience of the evening. His feet, in their worn boots, pressed against the floor with steady pressure. His back rested against the stool in a posture that had become automatic through repetition. His eyes, though tired from the day's activities, remained adequately alert, capable of noting details and changes should any occur. The fire drew his attention once more, that constant presence that demanded periodic assessment. The coals he had added most recently were burning well now, fully integrated into the fire's pattern, glowing with the same intensity as the older pieces. The flames that moved among them had taken on a lazy quality, less vigorous than earlier but still adequate, still providing the necessary heat. He calculated, based on the fire's appearance and his internal sense of elapsed time, that another half-hour might pass before attention would be required, perhaps longer if the night remained quiet and still. This calculation was not precise, more an approximation based on experience than any exact measurement, but it proved reliable enough for his purposes. He need not watch the fire constantly, need not hover over it with anxious attention. It would burn as fires burn, consuming its fuel at rates determined by the coal's quality and the air's availability, requiring intervention only periodically to maintain its continuity. Between these interventions, he could allow his attention to rest elsewhere, trusting the fire to manage itself adequately within the parameters he had established. The lamps, too, required less attention now than earlier in the evening. Their reservoirs held sufficient oil to carry them through several more hours, their wicks burned at proper heights, their chimneys remained clean enough to transmit light effectively. They would need refilling in the morning, trimming and cleaning as part of the daily maintenance routine, but for the present they functioned satisfactorily, requiring only occasional glances to ensure their continued proper operation. The keeper found himself settling into that state of consciousness peculiar to long, quiet vigils, a condition somewhere between wakefulness and drowsiness, alert enough to notice any significant change or sound, relaxed enough to rest without actually sleeping. His breathing had slowed, his heartbeat steady and unhurried, his body conserving energy while remaining ready to respond if response became necessary. His eyes remained open but had lost their sharp focus, seeing the room as a whole rather than examining specific details, registering the overall scene without analyzing its components. Time continued its patient advance, minutes accumulating into quarter hours building toward full hours, the evening progressing through its span toward the night's deeper reaches. The clock marked these passages with its periodic chimes, single notes that entered the silence and faded, leaving behind only the resumed ticking that measured smaller intervals. Each chime confirmed time's continuance, verified the clock's proper function, provided a momentary punctuation in the otherwise unbroken quiet. The room maintained its character through all these passages of time, its essential nature unchanged by the hours that elapsed within it. The fire burned lower or higher depending on the keeper's interventions, but always burned, always provided warmth. The lamps glowed steadily, their flames consuming oil at rates that varied slightly but remained generally constant. The furniture stood in its places, the curtains hung at the windows, the floor supported all that rested upon it. Everything continued, everything persisted, everything fulfilled its function through simple continuance. The keeper, as much a part of this continuance as any element of the room, maintained his post behind the sideboard, his presence steady, his attention available, his readiness constant. He had performed this role countless times before, would perform it countless times again, each evening similar to the last, each night part of the endless succession of nights that constituted his work and his life. There was no drama in this continuance, no excitement or variation beyond minor details, merely the patient fulfillment of duty through presence and attention. His thoughts, moving slowly through this quiet space, touched briefly on memories of previous winters, of nights when snow had fallen thick enough to close the roads, when the inn had sheltered travelers stranded by weather, when the common room had been full of guests grateful for warmth and shelter. Those nights had required different efforts, more activity, constant attention to multiple needs simultaneously. But such nights were rare, the exception rather than the rule, most evenings passing in quietness similar to this one, waiting that was never fulfilled, readiness that was never tested. He did not prefer one type of evening to another, found satisfaction in both the active nights and the quiet ones, each serving the inn's purpose in its way. The active nights demonstrated the inn's value, its necessity, its function in providing essential services. The quiet nights allowed maintenance and preparation, ensured readiness for when activity did occur. Together they formed the complete pattern of the inn's existence, neither complete without the other, both necessary to the whole. The fire settled once more, a gentle adjustment that required no immediate response. The keeper noted it without concern, filing the information away, knowing he would attend to it when the appropriate time came. For now, he remained at his post, his hands on the sideboard, his weight on the stool, his presence steady in the lamplight, fulfilling his function through patient continuance, serving his purpose through reliable availability, existing in the quiet passage of evening hours, waiting without impatience for whatever might or might not come, content in the simple continuation of his work and his watch. The keeper's hands moved to adjust his position slightly on the stool, easing a minor discomfort that had developed in his lower back. The adjustment was small, barely perceptible, yet it provided relief, redistributing his weight in a manner that reduced the pressure on the area that had begun to protest. These small movements punctuated his stillness, necessary concessions to the body's needs, brief interruptions in the otherwise sustained immobility that characterized his vigil. His eyes traveled once more around the room, following a circuit that had become automatic through repetition. Beginning with the hearth, moving across to the nearest table, progressing along the row of tables toward the door, following the wall to the window, continuing around to complete the circle back to the sideboard. This visual patrol required no conscious direction, his gaze simply following the familiar path, noting that all remained as it should, that nothing had changed or required attention. The circuit complete, his eyes returned to the middle distance, focusing on nothing in particular, simply resting while remaining receptive to any movement or change. The warmth from the fire reached him in gentle waves, not the intense heat experienced when standing directly before the hearth, but a milder radiation that traveled across the intervening space to touch his face and hands with barely perceptible warmth. This modest heat was pleasant rather than overwhelming, a reminder of the fire's presence without demanding attention or response. It contributed to the room's overall comfort, blending with the still air to create an environment neither too warm nor too cool, balanced in that narrow range that allowed the body to rest without strain. A slight shift in the fire's burning pattern caused a momentary brightening, a brief increase in the flame's vigor as a pocket of particularly combustible material was reached and consumed. The increased light cast slightly different shadows momentarily, altering the room's appearance in subtle ways before the fire settled back to its previous steady state. The keeper noted this fluctuation without concern, recognizing it as normal variation rather than any indication of problem or need. Fires did not burn with absolute consistency, small changes in their intensity were natural and expected. The stool beneath him had developed its own familiar character through years of use, the wood shaped by the weight it had borne, conforming slightly to the form of those who had sat upon it. The keeper's own contribution to this shaping was impossible to distinguish from that of his predecessors, the wood remembering all who had rested there through the gradual modification of its surface. Yet the stool remained fundamentally sound, its legs firm, its seat solid, capable of continuing its service for years to come despite the wear it had already absorbed. His attention drifted to considerations of the building's age, trying to recall what he knew of its history. The inn had stood for generations before his tenure began, its origins extending back beyond living memory into the realm of stories and imprecise accounts. The stone walls were original, certainly, their construction showing the techniques of an earlier era. The beams overhead were equally old, massive timbers that could only have come from trees now long since vanished from the surrounding countryside. The floor, though worn, retained its original planks in most areas, they were darkened and compressed by decades of foot traffic. Various modifications and repairs had been made over the years, of course. Windows had been replaced when glass broke or frames rotted. Portions of the roof had received attention when slates failed. The chimney had been rebuilt at some point, though whether this occurred before or during his time he could not with certainty recall. These interventions had maintained the building's functionality without altering its essential character, preserving rather than transforming, ensuring continuity rather than change. The keeper found a kind of comfort in this continuity, in being part of a succession of keepers who had maintained this place, each performing similar duties, each keeping similar vigils, each tending fires and lamps and attending to the countless small tasks that kept the inn functioning. His own contribution was modest, merely maintaining what others had established, preserving what had been entrusted to him. Yet this preservation itself had value, ensuring that the inn would continue beyond his tenure, serving future travelers and villagers as it had served those of the past. His hands lay flat on the sideboard surface, fingers spread slightly, palms in full contact with the wood. He could feel the grain through his skin, the slight irregularities that gave the surface texture, the coolness that the wood maintained despite the room's warmth. This tactile connection to the physical reality of the inn grounded him, provided a direct sensory link to the substance of the place he tended. The wood was real, solid, enduring, qualities that extended to the entire structure of which it formed a part. The clock's mechanism whirred briefly before delivering its chime, the single note marking another quarter-hour's passage. The sound hung in the air momentarily before dissipating, absorbed by the room's surfaces, leaving behind only the resumed ticking that measured the smaller intervals of time. The keeper's internal sense of duration aligned with the clock's measurement, confirming that his estimation of elapsed time remained accurate. This concordance between internal and external timekeeping pleased him in a small way, evidence that his faculties remained reliable despite fatigue. He shifted his gaze to the nearest lamp, studying its flame with the attention born of long practice. The flame stood nearly vertical, indicating the air's stillness, moving in barely perceptible ways as minute currents touched it. The light it cast was steady and warm, the color that came from properly adjusted wick height and clean burning oil. No smoke discolored the chimney's interior, no sputtering indicated water or impurity in the fuel. The lamp performed its function exactly as designed, converting oil into light with the efficiency that good maintenance ensured. Beyond the lamp's immediate illumination, shadows gathered with varying degrees of depth. Some areas remained reasonably well lit through the combined contribution of multiple lamps. Others, farther from light sources or blocked by furniture, held deeper darkness. The contrast between light and shadow gave the room its nighttime character, transforming spaces that appeared ordinary in daylight into regions of mystery and depth. Yet this transformation was benign rather than threatening, the shadows holding no danger, merely representing areas where light had not reached. The keeper's breathing had settled into a rhythm so regular he was barely aware of it, each inhalation and exhalation occurring without conscious direction, his body managing this essential function automatically while his attention remained available for other matters. The air he breathed carried faint scents that characterized the room. The smell of burning coal, the slight oily odor from the lamps, the woody scent of old furniture, the indefinable combination of aromas that accumulated in any long-inhabited space. These smells were so familiar he rarely noticed them consciously, yet they contributed to his sense of place, his recognition of being exactly where he belonged. A slight creaking sound came from overhead, the building's timbers adjusting to temperature changes as the night progressed and the structure cooled. The keeper identified the sound without alarm, recognizing it as normal building behavior, the wood expanding and contracting in response to thermal variations, producing sounds that were more noticeable in the quiet of night than during the day's greater activity. These sounds were the building's voice, its way of communicating its continuing existence, its ongoing response to the forces acting upon it. His body had grown increasingly still as the evening progressed, movement reduced to only what was necessary for basic comfort and essential tasks. This stillness was not uncomfortable, rather it represented a kind of rest, a conservation of energy during a period when activity was not required. His muscles had relaxed from their daytime tension, his posture had softened into the stool's support, his breathing and heartbeat had slowed to their resting rates. Yet he remained alert, capable of immediate response should circumstances demand it, his apparent rest not extending to actual sleep or significant impairment of awareness. The fire would need attention soon, his internal sense of timing suggested. Not immediately, but within the next little while, before the coals separated sufficiently to threaten the fire's continuity. This knowledge rested quietly in his mind, requiring no immediate action but preparing him for the task that would shortly be necessary. When the time came, he would rise, approach the hearth, tend the fire with his usual competence, then return to his post. The cycle would repeat as it had repeated throughout the evening, as it would continue to repeat until he finally retired for the night. His thoughts turned briefly to the question of when that retirement would occur. No fixed schedule governed this decision, rather, he would know when the time came, when some internal calculation determined that remaining at his post no longer served any useful purpose, that the likelihood of guests arriving had diminished to effective impossibility, that his body's need for proper rest outweighed his duty to maintain readiness. This decision point lay somewhere in the hours ahead, not yet arrived but gradually approaching, the evening's arc slowly bending toward its conclusion. Until that moment came, however, he would remain, his presence constant, his attention available, his readiness maintained. This was his function, his purpose, his contribution to the inn's operation. Whatever else might be uncertain, this was clear. While he occupied this post, the inn remained open in spirit if not in actual practice, available to serve should service be required, ready to fulfill its purpose should purpose present itself. The fact that purpose might not present itself did not diminish the value of maintaining readiness, did not reduce the importance of his vigil. The room continued in its state of patient waiting, unchanged by time's passage except for the slow diminishment of coal in the fire and oil in the lamps, both consuming their substance and performing their functions, both gradually approaching the point where replenishment would be necessary. But these needs lay in the future, not yet urgent, allowing the present moment to continue without interruption, maintaining the evening's established rhythm of quiet continuance. The keeper's hands remained on the sideboard, his weight rested on the stool, his eyes surveyed the room with patient regularity. The fire burned, the lamps glowed, the clock ticked, the building stood firm around him. All continued as it should, as it had, as it would, the evening progressing through its measured span toward whatever conclusion awaited it, hours yet distant, considerations yet unmade, decisions deferred to their proper times. The keeper finally stirred himself to action, prompted by his internal sense that the fire had burned long enough without attention. He rose from the stool with the deliberate movement that characterized all his actions, his body unfolding from its seated position, straightening to its full height. A slight stiffness had developed during his extended sitting, nothing concerning, merely the body's natural response to sustained immobility. He flexed his shoulders briefly, rolled his head gently from side to side, then moved toward the hearth with his measured pace. The fire had indeed burned down to the point where intervention was advisable. The coals, though still glowing with adequate heat, had separated somewhat, creating gaps that would gradually widen if not addressed. The flames had diminished to small flickering presences, more suggestion than substance, barely visible among the glowing pieces. He took up the poker from its stand, the iron cool in his hand despite its proximity to the heat, and began the familiar work of consolidating the coals, drawing them together, rebuilding their collective mass. The poker moved among the glowing pieces with practiced efficiency, each motion serving a purpose, gathering the scattered coals into a more compact arrangement. Small showers of sparks rose occasionally as the poker disturbed the fire's structure, brief constellations that flared and died almost instantly, their momentary brightness contributing nothing to the actual illumination but adding a fleeting beauty to the work. The keeper paid them little attention, focused on the task itself rather than its incidental effects. With the coals properly arranged, he set the poker aside and reached for fresh fuel from the coal scuttle. His hands, protected by their long familiarity with this work, selected appropriate pieces, gauging their size and quality through touch and brief examination. Each piece was placed deliberately, positioned to build upon the existing fire, arranged to ensure proper burning. The new coal sat black against the glowing bed, its surface dull and unreflective, waiting for heat to transform it from cold mineral into glowing ember. He remained before the fire for several moments, observing the beginning of this transformation, ensuring the new fuel was properly integrated, that the fire accepted the addition without being smothered by it. Smoke rose as the coal's volatile components began to release, thin wisps that the chimney drew upward, removing them from the room before they could accumulate. Gradually, the smoke diminished as the coal's surface temperature increased, small flames appearing where gases met sufficient heat to ignite, spreading across the coal's surface in patterns determined by its structure and composition. Satisfied that the fire was progressing appropriately, the keeper returned the tools to their stand and stepped back from the intense heat. His face had grown warm from proximity to the flames, a flush that would dissipate shortly once he moved away. He brushed his hands against each other, dislodging any coal dust that might have transferred during handling, though his hands had been relatively clean to begin with, the coal being of good quality with minimal loose material. Rather than returning immediately to his post, he took the opportunity to walk the room's perimeter, a circuit that allowed his body continued movement, preventing the stiffness that came from alternating between sitting and standing without intermediate activity. His steps carried him along the wall, past the row of tables, each receiving his brief glance as he passed. The furniture remained exactly as positioned, undisturbed by any presence other than his own, waiting patiently for the occupancy that would give it purpose. At the window, he paused to lift the curtain slightly, peering out into the darkness beyond the glass. Nothing was visible through the night's opacity, no light from neighboring buildings, no movement in the street, nothing but blackness absolute and complete. He allowed the curtain to fall back into place, its heavy fabric blocking any draft that might seep through the window's imperfect seal. The night outside remained unknown and unknowable, its character and conditions hidden from observation, relevant only insofar as they might affect travelers who might seek shelter, and no travelers had appeared. His circuit continued, bringing him past the door with its heavy bolt, past the sideboard where his stool waited, completing the circle at the hearth where he had begun. The room had yielded no surprises during this inspection, everything remaining as it should, as he had known it would. Yet the inspection itself had value, not in discovering problems but in confirming their absence, in verifying through direct observation what assumption already suggested. He returned to his position behind the sideboard, settling once more onto the stool, his body accepting the familiar posture, his hands finding their accustomed place on the wooden surface. From this resumed vantage point, the room appeared exactly as it had before his brief absence, the fire now burning with renewed vigor following his attention, the lamps maintaining their steady glow, everything continuing in its established pattern. The keeper's mind, having addressed the immediate task of tending the fire, drifted back into its state of gentle contemplation, thoughts moving without particular direction through considerations that required no resolution. He thought about the morning that would eventually arrive, the transition from night to day that would bring an end to this vigil and the beginning of new tasks. There would be ashes to clear from the grate, breakfast to prepare if guests required it, floors to sweep, surfaces to dust, the accumulated minor debris of existence to address through cleaning and organization. These future tasks existed at a comfortable distance, not yet pressing, not yet demanding attention, merely waiting their turn in the endless succession of work that constituted his life. He felt no anxiety about them, no reluctance to face them, merely the quiet acknowledgement that they would come and would be addressed when they came. For now, the evening's tasks remained his focus, the fire and lamps and maintenance of readiness that characterized these nighttime hours. The warmth in the room had increased slightly following the fire's refreshment, not dramatically but noticeably, the enhanced combustion producing additional heat that radiated outward into the surrounding space. The keeper appreciated this increased warmth, feeling it gently press against him from across the room, a subtle but pleasant change in his physical comfort. The evening had grown cool enough that this additional heat was welcome, contributing to the room's overall comfort without becoming excessive. His eyes tracked to the clock on the mantelpiece, noting the position of its hands. The evening had progressed considerably, though substantial time remained before the hour when he would normally consider retiring. The night was perhaps a third completed, possibly more, time's passage steady but somehow difficult to measure precisely in the absence of external events to mark its progression. The clock provided objective verification of elapsed time, but the keeper's internal sense sometimes struggled to align with the clock's precise measurement, minutes feeling longer or shorter depending on his state of mind and level of activity. A slight sound from overhead drew his attention briefly upward, another of the building's small adjustments to temperature and load, timber settling into its position with a creak that was more audible than significant. The ceiling beams remained solid and straight, their positions unchanged except in the minute ways that were invisible but audible, the wood's fibers shifting in response to forces too subtle for visual detection but sufficient to produce sound. The keeper's ears had grown attuned to these building sounds over years of occupation, able to distinguish normal settling from anything that might indicate actual concern. His hands on the sideboard had grown warm from contact with his own body, the wood's coolness gradually yielding to the continuous presence of his palms. This small transfer of heat meant little in practical terms but created a minor connection between keeper and inn, his warmth flowing into the building's substance, the building's coolness drawing heat from his body, a tiny exchange that symbolized the larger relationship between inhabitant and structure. The lamps continued their consumption of oil, each flame drawing fuel upward through its wick, converting liquid to light through the steady process of combustion. The keeper calculated mentally how long the current oil levels would sustain the flames, estimating that several hours remained before any lamp would require replenishment. This calculation was imprecise but adequate for his purposes, providing assurance that the lamps would not fail during the hours he intended to remain at his post. His breathing had settled into barely perceptible movement, each breath drawn and released with minimal visible motion, his chest rising and falling in small increments that marked life's continuation without announcing it boldly. This quiet respiration matched the room's overall stillness, the keeper becoming part of the general tranquility rather than disturbing it through more vigorous life signs. He existed in a state of minimal necessary activity, conserving energy while remaining present and aware. The fire's renewed burning produced occasional small sounds, pops and snaps as coal structure yielded to heat, gases escaping through cracks, pieces settling into new positions. These sounds provided irregular punctuation to the clock's steady ticking, adding unpredictability to the otherwise measured acoustic environment. The keeper's ears registered each sound without his conscious attention dwelling on it, his awareness simply noting and filing the information without requiring mental commentary or response. Time advanced through another quarter hour, the clock delivering its single chime to mark the passage, the sound familiar to the point of being expected yet still managing to puncture the silence with its clear tone. The keeper acknowledged the chime with a slight nod, an unconscious physical response to the temporal marker, his body's way of noting the information even as his mind remained focused elsewhere or nowhere, suspended in that state between active thought and simple presence that characterized these long quiet vigils. The evening continued its slow progression, the room maintaining its character, the keeper fulfilling his function through patient continuance. Nothing had changed except time's accumulation, minutes building into hours, the night advancing toward its conclusion still distant but gradually approaching, inevitable as all temporal progressions were inevitable, carrying the evening forward through its span toward the eventual morning that waited beyond the darkness, beyond the continuing quiet, beyond the keeper's present vigil. The keeper found his thoughts turning to the nature of his work, the peculiar quality of spending so many hours in preparation for events that might never occur. Most labor produced visible results, tangible accomplishments that could be pointed to with satisfaction. Bread baked, fields plowed, goods manufactured, all left evidence of effort expended and purpose achieved. His work, on these quiet evenings, produced nothing visible. The fire burned whether guests came or not. The lamps glowed for his eyes alone. The room's readiness served no immediate purpose beyond its own maintenance. Yet he did not find this futility troubling. The readiness itself had value, he believed, even when not tested. The inn's reputation depended partly on consistency, on travelers knowing they could rely on finding shelter and warmth whenever they arrived. This reliability required maintaining standards even during periods when those standards went unobserved by others. To let the fire die, to extinguish the lamps prematurely, to abandon his post simply because no guests had appeared would be to undermine the very foundation of the inn's trustworthiness. His hands moved slightly on the sideboard, adjusting their position, his fingers spreading and then drawing together again in a small unconscious gesture. The wood beneath them had grown nearly as warm as his palms, the temperature differential between keeper and inn diminishing through their sustained contact. This minor achievement pleased him in some indefinable way, as though he had managed to share his warmth with the building itself, contributing something back to the structure that sheltered him. A memory surfaced unbidden, of a winter night years ago when travelers had indeed arrived, a family caught by unexpected snowfall, desperate for shelter. He recalled their gratitude at finding the inn open and ready, the children's faces brightening in the firelight, the parents' relief evident in their expressions. That night his vigil had been rewarded with purpose, his readiness tested and proven adequate. Such nights were rare but memorable, standing out against the background of quiet evenings like this one where preparation went unneeded. The memory faded back into the general collection of experiences that constituted his history with the inn, neither forgotten nor actively retained, simply filed away where it could surface when prompted by association or random chance. His mind returned to the present moment, to the room that surrounded him, to the fire and lamps and familiar furniture that comprised his immediate reality. The past had its place, but the present demanded attention, not urgent or intense attention, but the gentle awareness that prevented neglect and ensured continuity. He noticed that one of the lamps, the one positioned nearest the door, had begun to burn with a barely perceptible unevenness, its flame showing the slightest tendency toward wavering that had not been present earlier. This could indicate a draft, though he felt no movement of air, or perhaps the wick had developed a small irregularity, or the oil level had dropped to a point where the reservoir's shape began to affect fuel delivery. Whatever the cause, the effect was minimal, not yet requiring intervention but worth monitoring. The keeper made a mental note to check that lamp during his next circuit of the room, but felt no need to address it immediately. The flame still provided adequate light, still burned safely within acceptable parameters. Only if the wavering increased or other symptoms developed would action become necessary. This measured response to minor variations characterized his approach to maintenance, addressing problems when they reached significance rather than rushing to correct every tiny deviation from perfect function. His back had begun to ache again, a dull sensation that spread across the lower region where muscle and spine bore the strain of extended sitting. He shifted his weight once more, seeking a position that would reduce the discomfort, finding temporary relief through adjustment of his posture. The stool provided adequate support but was not designed for the extended occupancy he subjected it to during these evening vigils. A cushion might have improved comfort, but the inn possessed no such luxury, and he had grown accustomed to the stool's firm surface over years of use. The room's shadows had not changed position, the lamp steady burning maintaining consistent illumination, but the keeper's perception of them seemed to shift slightly as fatigue gradually accumulated in his eyes and mind. Shadows that earlier had seemed simply dark now appeared to possess subtle variations in depth and quality, some holding absolute blackness while others contained gradations of gray that suggested form within the darkness. This altered perception was mild, not concerning, merely evidence of his body's natural response to hours of sustained wakefulness. He blinked deliberately, several slow closings and openings of his eyelids, giving his eyes momentary rest from the effort of maintaining focus. The brief darkness behind his closed lids felt restful, a respite from visual input, though he did not allow the closures to extend beyond a second or two, unwilling to risk the descent into sleep that longer darkness might encourage. His vigilance must be maintained, his awareness preserved, even as his body signaled its gradual accumulation of fatigue. The fire continued its consumption of the coal he had added, the black pieces now showing red cracks where heat had penetrated their surface, beginning the transformation from cold fuel to glowing ember. This process proceeded at its own pace, determined by the coal's composition and the fire's temperature, requiring no further intervention from him beyond patient observation. He watched it briefly, finding satisfaction in witnessing this gradual change, this reliable progression from one state to another following natural laws that operated without human direction once the proper conditions were established. Beyond the walls, the village slept, he presumed, its inhabitants long since retired to their beds, their houses dark and quiet. The inn stood as perhaps the only building maintaining light at this hour, its windows glowing faintly behind their curtains, a beacon that went largely unobserved in the night's emptiness. This isolation did not trouble him, rather it reinforced his sense of purpose, his role as the waking guardian while others rested, maintaining standards during hours when maintenance might seem unnecessary. The clock's mechanism engaged once more, preparing to deliver its quarter-hour chime, the preliminary whirring barely audible but familiar enough that the keeper recognized it, anticipating the sound that would follow. The chime came, clear and singular, marking time's passage with mechanical precision, then fell silent, leaving only the resumed ticking that measured smaller intervals. Another quarter-hour had passed, added to the evening's accumulation, bringing the night incrementally closer to its eventual conclusion. His hands had grown restless again, requiring occupation beyond simply resting on the sideboard. He reached for a cloth kept in a drawer beneath the counter, a piece of soft fabric used for polishing and cleaning, and began to rub the sideboard's surface in slow circular motions. The wood was already clean, already polished from previous attention, but the activity gave his hands purpose, provided an outlet for the minor energy that occasionally built up despite his general stillness. The cloth moved over the wood's surface, following the grain, applying gentle pressure that neither added nor removed any significant material but created a connection between keeper and object through the medium of sustained contact. The motion was repetitive, almost meditative, requiring no conscious direction once begun, his hands simply continuing the circular pattern while his mind remained free to wander or rest as it chose. This small activity served dual purposes, occupying his hands while maintaining the sideboard's condition, combining practical function with the satisfaction of purposeful movement. After several minutes of this polishing, he folded the cloth carefully and returned it to its drawer, the sideboard's surface now gleaming slightly more than before, though the difference was subtle enough to be barely noticeable. His hands returned to their resting position, the brief activity having satisfied their need for occupation, allowing them to settle once more into stillness. The room maintained its established character through all these small activities and observations, its essential nature unchanged by the keeper's minor interventions and quiet thoughts. The fire burned, the lamps glowed, the clock ticked, the building stood firm, everything continuing in its proper function, everything maintaining its expected condition. The evening progressed through its measured span, accumulating time without drama, advancing toward its conclusion without urgency, simply continuing as evenings continued, one moment following another in the patient succession that constituted duration. The keeper remained at his post, his presence constant, his attention available, his readiness maintained. The work he performed was largely invisible, consisting primarily of continued presence and watchful awareness, but it was work nonetheless, requiring sustained commitment and patient endurance. Hours had passed since he first took his position for the evening, hours would pass still before he would feel justified in retiring. Through all these hours, he would continue, fulfilling his function through simple persistence, serving the inn through his steady presence, maintaining standards through his reliable vigilance. The keeper's gaze traveled once more to the hearth, drawn by that constant need to assess and monitor the fire's condition. The coal he had added was burning well now, fully integrated into the fire's structure, contributing its heat to the room's warmth. The flames had strengthened somewhat, dancing with more vigor than earlier, their light casting moving shadows across the hearthstones and the floor immediately before the fireplace. This increased activity was temporary, he knew. The flames would settle again as the coal burned past its most volatile phase, returning to the steadier glow that characterized well-established fires. He considered whether to add more coal now, building the fire higher in anticipation of the cold hours that lay ahead, or to wait until the current fuel had burned further down. The decision was not pressing, either approach would serve adequately, but he found himself dwelling on the question nonetheless, turning it over in his mind as though it possessed significance beyond its actual importance. Eventually he concluded that waiting made more sense, allowing the current coal to burn more completely before adding fresh fuel, maintaining the fire through periodic additions rather than building it excessively high. This decision made, his mind released the question, moving on to other considerations or simply resting in the absence of pressing concerns. The evening had acquired a timeless quality, each moment similar enough to the last that they blended together, creating an extended present that seemed to stretch indefinitely in both directions. The earlier part of the evening felt distant yet recent, the eventual end seemed both far away and somehow imminent, time's passage becoming increasingly difficult to judge with precision despite the clock's regular measurements. His body had settled into a state of profound stillness, movement reduced to the barest minimum required for breathing and maintaining circulation. This stillness was not uncomfortable, though neither was it entirely without strain, his muscles gradually accumulating the minor aches that came from sustained positioning. Yet these discomforts remained manageable, not severe enough to compel movement, merely present as background sensations that his consciousness noted without dwelling upon them. The lamp nearest his position drew his attention, its flame burning with perfect steadiness, the wick height precisely adjusted, the oil flowing smoothly through the mechanism that drew it upward into the flame. He studied this lamp with appreciation for its simple efficiency, its reliable conversion of fuel into light through principles that were ancient and proven. No complexity marked its operation, no sophisticated mechanisms required maintenance, merely the straightforward burning that occurred when oil, wick, and flame came together in proper proportion. Beyond this nearest lamp, the others continued their service, each contributing its portion of light to the room's illumination. Together they pushed back the darkness, creating an island of visibility within the surrounding night, defining the space through their collective radiance. Without them, the fire alone would provide insufficient light, leaving much of the room in shadow too deep for comfortable occupation. The lamps were essential, their function as important as the fire's warmth, both necessary for the room to serve its purpose as a welcoming space. The keeper's thoughts drifted to considerations of the oil supply, mentally reviewing the inventory stored in the back room. Several large containers waited there, sealed against evaporation and contamination, sufficient for weeks of normal use. The supplier would deliver more in due course, maintaining the stock before it ran low, the arrangements made long ago and continuing through habitual repetition. This aspect of the inn's operation required little active management, the patterns established and self-perpetuating, needing only occasional attention when circumstances deviated from normal expectations. A faint sound reached his ears from outside, indistinct and brief, possibly a night creature moving through the street, or wind finding voice against some obstacle, or imagination filling the silence with phantom noises. He listened for a moment, alert to any repetition or clarification, but the sound did not recur and he returned to his former state of relaxed attention. The night held many small sounds that meant nothing, required no response, deserved no concern beyond brief acknowledgement. His hands on the sideboard had grown completely comfortable in their position, the wood's temperature now matching his own, no sensation of warmth or coolness passing between palm and surface. This thermal equilibrium created an almost seamless connection, as though his hands had become part of the sideboard itself, integrated into its structure through sustained contact. He flexed his fingers slightly, reasserting their separate identity, then allowed them to settle once more into their resting position. The room's air had grown slightly drier, the fire's heat gradually reducing the moisture content, creating an atmosphere that was comfortable for breathing but that made the skin feel taut, particularly around the eyes and lips. The keeper moistened his lips with his tongue, a small gesture that provided momentary relief, then forgot about the dryness as his attention moved elsewhere. These minor physical sensations arose and faded continuously, most going unnoticed, a few registering briefly before being dismissed or accommodated. Time advanced through another of its quarter-hour intervals, though the keeper did not consciously track its passage, the clock's chime arriving as both expected and surprising, its sound familiar yet retaining the capacity to puncture his reverie. He acknowledged the chime with an internal notation, filing away the information that another segment of evening had elapsed, then released the observation, allowing his mind to return to its unfocused state. The fire had settled into a particularly stable configuration, the coals arranged by chance into a pattern that promoted efficient burning, the flames finding optimal paths through the fuel, the heat radiating outward with unusual consistency. Such moments occurred randomly, the fire occasionally achieving a kind of perfection that required no adjustment, merely appreciation and patience until the configuration inevitably changed as consumption altered the coal's positions. The keeper found himself thinking about sleep, not with any immediate intention of seeking it, but as an abstract consideration, wondering how many hours remained before his body would demand rest rather than simply desiring it. Fatigue had been accumulating gradually throughout the evening, a slow building of the need for recovery that eventually would become impossible to defer. But that point remained distant, his constitution strong enough to maintain wakefulness for hours yet, his sense of duty sufficient to overcome the body's preference for rest. His eyes moved to the ceiling again, tracing the lines of the beams, following their spans across the room's width. The wood's darkness made details difficult to discern in the lamplight, the grain and texture mostly hidden, only the beam's outline and general form visible from his position below. Yet he knew their character from previous examination in better light, knew the particular patterns of each beam, the places where knots interrupted the grain, where age had created small splits that posed no structural concern. These beams had supported the ceiling for generations, would continue supporting it for generations more if properly maintained. Their strength came from the massive trees that had yielded them, trees cut long ago from forests that might themselves no longer exist, transformed into building material that outlasted the living wood's natural span. The keeper found something profound in this transformation, this conversion of natural growth into architectural support, life's substance repurposed to serve human need long after life itself had ceased. His reverie was interrupted by a need to shift position once more, his body asserting its discomfort with sufficient insistence to overcome his stillness. He rose from the stool, slowly and with care, his joints protesting mildly as they adjusted to the change in position. Standing, he stretched carefully, extending his arms, rolling his shoulders, loosening the tightness that had accumulated during his extended sitting. The movement felt beneficial, circulation improving, muscles releasing their tension, his body remembering what it was to occupy space through motion rather than sustained stillness. He walked toward the nearest window, his steps deliberate and measured, covering the distance without haste. At the window, he lifted the curtain once more, peering out into the continuing darkness, seeing nothing but his own faint reflection in the glass, a ghostly image created by the lamplight behind him. The night beyond remained impenetrable, yielding no information about conditions or events occurring outside the inn's walls. He allowed the curtain to fall back into place and turned away, resuming his circuit of the room. His circuit carried him past the row of tables, each familiar in its placement and condition, each representing a station where guests might sit if guests were present. The table's surfaces showed the wear of long use, the wood-bearing scratches and marks that accumulated despite careful maintenance, each imperfection a small record of some past moment when knife or mug or careless movement had left its trace. Collectively, these marks formed a kind of history, though one without narrative coherence, merely the physical evidence of countless minor incidents whose specific details had been forgotten or never known. At the far table, the one position nearest the door, he paused to brush away a few small particles of something, dust perhaps or tiny fragments of dried mud tracked in earlier and since dislodged from someone's boots. His hand swept the debris onto the floor where it would be collected during tomorrow's sweeping, adding its small contribution to the daily accumulation of material that gathered despite all efforts at cleanliness. Perfection was not achievable in a working inn, only the constant effort to approach it through regular attention and care. He moved on toward the door itself, that solid barrier of oak reinforced with iron fittings, its surface dark with age and the oils from countless hands that had pushed it open or pulled it closed over the years of its service. The bolt was drawn, he confirmed, the door secured against casual entry, though a determined effort could likely force it if someone truly wished to gain entrance. But such determination seemed unlikely on a quiet night in a peaceful village where most inhabitants knew each other and strangers were rare enough to be noteworthy. His hand rested briefly on the door's surface, feeling the wood's coolness, the slight roughness where weather had textured its exterior face, the solidity that spoke of proper construction and adequate thickness. This door had protected the inn through all weathers and all seasons, admitting thousands of guests while keeping out the elements, serving its dual function of barrier and threshold with equal reliability. It would continue this service long after his own tenure ended, outlasting the keeper as it had outlasted previous keepers, as it would outlast those who followed him. Turning from the door, he continued his circuit, moving along the wall toward the corner where shadows gathered most deeply. Here the lamplight barely reached, the illumination insufficient to fully dispel the darkness, creating a region of ambiguous visibility where objects were suggested rather than clearly defined. Yet he knew what occupied this space, a small table and 2 chairs that saw little use, positioned too far from the fire to be desirable on cold evenings, selected only when the better locations were already occupied. His path brought him back toward the hearth, completing the circuit, returning him to the room's center of warmth and light. The fire greeted him with its steady burning, unchanged during his brief absence, requiring nothing from him yet, content to continue its consumption of fuel at its own determined pace. He stood before it for a moment, appreciating the heat against his face and hands, allowing the warmth to penetrate his clothing and reach the skin beneath, a pleasant sensation that countered the slight chill he had experienced in the room's farther reaches. The poker stood in its accustomed place, ready for use when needed, its iron surface reflecting the firelight in subtle gleams that shifted as the flames moved. He did not reach for it yet, the fire's condition not warranting intervention, but its presence provided reassurance, the knowledge that the proper tool waited ready should circumstances require it. This readiness extended to all aspects of the inn's operation, tools and supplies positioned where they could be accessed efficiently, nothing left to chance or requiring search when need arose. He returned to his position behind the sideboard, settling once more onto the stool, his body accepting the familiar seat with a slight sense of homecoming, as though this place represented his natural position, the location where he properly belonged. His hands found their position on the wood surface, the warmth they had earlier imparted now returned to them, a small exchange that created continuity between his previous occupancy and this resumption. The room appeared exactly as it had before his circuit, no changes evident, no alterations in the arrangement or condition of anything within it. This constancy was precisely what he maintained through his vigil, this preservation of proper state, this prevention of deviation or decline. His work consisted largely of ensuring that nothing changed inappropriately, that everything remained as it should, that the inn stood ready in consistent condition regardless of whether that readiness was tested by actual use. His eyes felt heavier now, the accumulated hours of wakefulness asserting themselves through increased desire for rest. He blinked slowly, deliberately, fighting the tendency toward longer closures that would lead toward sleep. Vigilance required wakefulness, his duty demanded consciousness, and he would maintain both through whatever effort proved necessary. The night was not yet so far advanced that retirement could be justified, hours remained during which travelers might conceivably arrive, and until those hours passed, he would remain at his post. The clock's ticking seemed louder now, or perhaps his attention had simply become more focused on it, the regular rhythm filling his awareness with its mechanical precision. Each tick represented another second elapsed, another increment of time consumed and passed beyond recall, the present moment continuously becoming the past through this relentless progression. He found himself counting the ticks briefly, reaching 10 before losing interest in the enumeration, allowing the sound to fade back into the background of his awareness. A coal in the fire shifted position, settling into a new configuration with a soft sound of adjustment, and small shower of sparks that rose briefly before extinguishing. The keeper noted this movement without concern, recognizing it as normal fire behavior, the inevitable result of fuel consumption gradually undermining the coal's stability. The fire would need attention soon, perhaps within the next quarter hour, the coals drawn together again and fresh fuel added to maintain the warmth the room required. His thoughts turned to the morning that would eventually arrive, bringing an end to this vigil and the beginning of a new cycle of tasks. There would be the fire to rebuild properly, the lamps to refill and clean, the floor to sweep, the surfaces to dust, the usual breakfast preparations if guests required feeding. These tasks stretched ahead in familiar sequence, each necessary, each part of the larger work of maintaining the inn's operation and standards. But morning remained distant, separated from the present by hours that must be endured through continued wakefulness and attention. He would see those hours through as he always did, maintaining his post, tending the fire and lamps, preserving the readiness that defined his purpose. The evening would progress at its own pace, neither hastened nor delayed by his desire for its conclusion, simply continuing through its measured span until the natural end arrived. The keeper's breathing had settled into a rhythm so regular and subtle that he was barely conscious of it, each inhalation and exhalation occurring without deliberate control, his body managing this essential function automatically while his mind remained available for other observations and considerations. The air he breathed had been warmed by the fire, dried by the heat, carrying the familiar scents that characterized the room's atmosphere, combination of smoke and oil and wood and age that together created the inn's distinctive smell. His hands lay still on the sideboard, fingers relaxed, palms flat against the wood surface. The connection between flesh and timber had become so familiar, so sustained, that he felt almost as though his hands had taken root there, growing into the sideboard through hours of contact, becoming permanent fixtures rather than temporary presences. Yet he knew he could lift them at any moment, break the connection with simple effort, reassert their independence from the surface they rested upon. The room continued in its state of patient waiting, unchanged by time's passage except for the slow diminishment of fuel in fire and lamps, both consuming their substance in the performance of their functions. Everything else remained constant, the furniture in its positions, the curtains at the windows, the floor beneath it all bearing the weight of everything the room contained. The inn stood firm, the keeper maintained his vigil, the evening progressed through its span toward whatever conclusion awaited it in the hours that remained before dawn's eventual arrival would transform night into day and release him from his watch. Yet the clock maintained its steady pace regardless, ticking away intervals with perfect consistency, indifferent to human perception of duration. He shifted slightly on the stool, easing a point of discomfort that had developed along his spine, the small movement providing temporary relief without significantly altering his overall position. These minor adjustments had become more frequent as the evening progressed, his body's tolerance for sustained stillness gradually diminishing despite his determination to remain at his post. Age played its part in this, he acknowledged without resentment, the years accumulating their effects on joints and muscles, reducing flexibility, increasing the effort required to maintain positions that had once been effortless. His gaze traveled to the nearest lamp, studying its flame with the attention born of long practice and genuine interest in its behavior. The flame stood nearly motionless, indicating the air's complete stillness, its shape a perfect teardrop tapering to a point where the combustion was most complete and the gases most fully consumed. The light it produced was warm in color, carrying the yellow tones characteristic of oil lamps, softer and less harsh than the white brightness of gas lighting that was becoming more common in larger establishments, though not yet practical for a modest village like this one. The lamp's glass chimney was clean, its transparency unmarred by the smoke deposits that would accumulate if the wick were improperly adjusted or the oil contained impurities. He took satisfaction in this cleanliness, evidence of proper maintenance, proof that his attention to detail yielded visible results. The chimney would need washing eventually, accumulation being inevitable over time, but that task lay in the future, not requiring immediate consideration or action. Beyond this lamp, the others continued their service, each contributing to the overall illumination, their combined light pushing back the darkness, defining the space as inhabitable rather than simply enclosed. He tried to imagine the room without them, relying solely on firelight for visibility, and recognized how much more limited and uncertain the space would become, shadows expanding to claim larger territories, details obscured, edges softened into ambiguity. The lamps were essential, their function crucial to the room's character and usability. His hands moved of their own accord, fingers drumming lightly on the sideboard surface in a rhythm that matched no particular pattern, simply expressing a need for minor movement, or release of small accumulated tensions. The drumming continued for several moments before he became conscious of it and stilled his fingers, returning them to their resting position. These unconscious movements emerged periodically, his body asserting its needs and preferences against his mind's intention to maintain stillness. The fire drew his attention once more, that constant presence that required periodic assessment. The coals had burned down somewhat, their glow less intense than earlier, though still adequate for providing warmth. The flames had diminished to occasional flickers, barely visible among the glowing pieces, suggesting that the time for intervention was approaching, though not yet arrived. He calculated that perhaps another 10 minutes might elapse before action became necessary, allowing him this brief additional period of rest before rising to tend the fire. This calculation was inexact, based on observation and experience rather than precise measurement, but it proved generally reliable, his internal sense of timing having been calibrated through countless previous repetitions of this task. He could afford to wait, allowing the fire to burn down a bit further, consolidating its heat into a more compact bed of coals that would more readily accept fresh fuel when the time came to add it. His thoughts drifted to the question of whether anyone in the village might be wakeful at this hour, or whether he alone maintained consciousness while all others slept. Likely there were others, he reasoned, people kept awake by illness or worry, infants crying in the night, perhaps someone else with duties requiring nighttime wakefulness. Yet the village felt profoundly asleep, the darkness beyond the inn's walls suggesting universal rest, as though he occupied the only point of light and awareness in a landscape given over entirely to slumber. This sense of isolation was not unwelcome. It carried a certain peaceful quality, a freedom from the obligations of social interaction, the demands of conversation and appropriate response. In these quiet hours, he existed primarily for himself and the inn, his attention focused inward or on immediate surroundings, released from the need to consider how he appeared to others or what they might expect from him. The solitude allowed a kind of rest even within wakefulness, a quieting of certain mental activities that interpersonal engagement required. The clock prepared to deliver its quarter-hour chime, the mechanism engaging with its preliminary sounds, warning of the note that would follow. The chime came, singular and clear, marking another segment of time elapsed, another 15 minutes added to the evening's accumulation. The keeper acknowledged the sound with a slight nod, an automatic physical response that occurred without conscious direction, his body marking the temporal progression even as his mind remained in its state of gentle drift. He considered rising to tend the fire now, preempting the need slightly, but decided to remain seated a bit longer, allowing his body additional rest before the minor exertion of fire tending. The decision was marginal, either choice being defensible, but he opted for continued stillness, postponing action until necessity made it clearly appropriate rather than merely advisable. This postponement was itself restful, the knowledge that he could delay, that urgency did not press, that time remained available for gradual transition from rest to activity. His eyes tracked slowly around the room, taking in the familiar sights without particular focus, simply allowing the visual information to enter his awareness without analysis or judgment. The tables stood in their places, the chairs arranged around them or pushed beneath them. The curtains hung at the windows, blocking the view of darkness beyond. The floor extended beneath everything, supporting the weight of furniture and keeper alike. The walls rose to meet the ceiling, enclosing the space, defining its boundaries, separating interior from exterior. Everything was as it should be, as it had been, as it would continue to be through the remaining hours of evening. This constancy was itself a kind of accomplishment, the maintenance of proper state through sustained attention and periodic intervention. His work consisted largely of preventing change, of ensuring that the inn remained ready, that standards were preserved, that decline was arrested through timely action. The lack of drama in this work did not diminish its value or importance. The warmth from the fire reached him in gentle waves, not intense but perceptible, a reminder of the heat source across the room. His face felt this warmth more than other parts of his body, the skin of his cheeks and forehead registering the subtle increase in temperature that distinguished the direction of the hearth from other directions. This physical awareness connected him to the fire, created a sensory link that operated continuously even when his attention was directed elsewhere. His breathing continued its shallow rhythm, each breath drawn and released with minimal effort, his lungs performing their function efficiently without requiring conscious oversight. The air moved in and out, sustaining life, providing oxygen to blood, removing waste gases, the entire process proceeding automatically according to patterns established long ago and maintained without thought. He existed as a breathing presence, his life marked by this continuous exchange between internal and external, body and atmosphere. The keeper's mind had begun to slow, thoughts coming less frequently, the intervals between them expanding as fatigue accumulated and wakefulness became more effortful to maintain. He was not yet approaching sleep, still firmly anchored in consciousness, but the quality of that consciousness had altered, becoming more passive, more receptive than active, content to register impressions without generating responses or pursuing extended chains of reasoning. In this state, the evening acquired an almost dreamlike quality, real but somehow distant, experienced but not quite grasped, his presence in the room certain yet his connection to it tenuous, as though he observed from slight remove rather than participating fully. This altered state was not unpleasant, carried its own subtle satisfactions, a letting go of certain mental tensions while maintaining the essential alertness that duty required. The fire shifted again, another coal settling into new position, the sound barely audible but sufficient to draw his attention. He looked toward the hearth, saw that the time had indeed come for intervention, the coals having separated enough that consolidation was now advisable rather than merely anticipatable. With a slight sigh, more from the effort of rising than from any reluctance, he pushed himself up from the stool and began moving toward the fire, his steps slow and deliberate, his body taking its time in transitioning from stillness to motion, conserving energy through measured movement rather than haste. The keeper reached the hearth with his customary unhurried approach, his body moving with the economy of motion that came from having performed this task countless times before. He stood for a moment before the fire, assessing its precise condition, noting the spacing of the coals, the depth of their glow, the minimal presence of active flames. His assessment confirmed what he had already surmised from his position at the sideboard. The fire required attention now, consolidation and fresh fuel to maintain its warmth through the hours that remained before morning. He took up the poker, that familiar weight settling into his hand with the comfort of long acquaintance, the iron cooled despite its proximity to heat, its surface smooth from years of handling. The poker moved among the coals with practiced precision, gathering the scattered pieces, drawing them together into a more compact arrangement. Each movement served a purpose, nothing wasted, the tools tip finding purchase among the glowing pieces, leveraging them into position with minimal effort. Small cascades of ash fell through the grate as he worked, settling into the pan beneath where they would be cleared away tomorrow, adding to the accumulation that required regular removal to prevent interference with the grate's proper function. The ash was fine and gray, the complete residue of combustion, all useful material having been consumed, leaving only this inert powder that served no further purpose beyond disposal. With the coals properly consolidated, he set the poker aside and reached for the coal scuttle, finding it lighter than earlier, its contents diminished by the evening's multiple additions to the fire. Sufficient coal remained for this feeding and perhaps one more before the scuttle would require refilling from the larger storage area. He selected pieces with his accustomed care, choosing sizes that would build upon the existing fire without overwhelming it, arranging them to ensure proper burning patterns would develop. The new coals sat black and cold atop the glowing bed, stark contrast in both color and temperature, accepting heat reluctantly at first before gradually yielding to the transformation that would convert it from fuel to flame to ember to ash. This progression would take time, the process unfolding at its own determined pace, but the keeper had initiated it properly, and nature would complete what he had begun. He remained before the fire for a long moment, observing the early stages of this transformation, ensuring that smoke cleared properly through the chimney, that no problems developed in the fire's acceptance of the new fuel. Satisfied that all proceeded as it should, he returned the coal scuttle to its place and made his way back toward the sideboard, his brief period of activity complete, his body ready to resume its seated position. The stool received him back with its familiar hardness, the wood pressing against him in ways his body recognized and accommodated, settling into the position it had occupied for so many hours already this evening. His hands found their place on the sideboard, completing his return to the posture of watchful waiting that characterized most of his vigil. The room appeared unchanged by his brief absence, everything remaining as it had been, only the fire showing evidence of his intervention. His breathing had quickened slightly from the minor exertion of tending the fire, though not enough to constitute actual effort, merely a small increase that would subside shortly as his body returned to its resting state. He waited patiently for this return, making no effort to control or hasten it, allowing his respiration to find its own pace as it always did, settling back into the shallow rhythm that sustained him with minimal expenditure of energy. The newly added coal was beginning to smoke as volatile components released under heating, thin wisps rising toward the chimney, drawn upward by the draft that the fire itself created. This smoke would diminish as temperature increased, giving way to the cleaner burning that characterized properly established combustion. For now, he noted its presence without concern, understanding it as a normal phase in the coal's transformation, temporary and self-resolving. His eyes felt heavy again, the brief activity having done little to reduce his accumulated fatigue, perhaps even increasing it slightly through the expenditure of energy his body wished to conserve. He blinked slowly, deliberately, fighting the temptation to allow his eyelids to remain closed, knowing that even a moment's surrender to that temptation could lead toward the sleep he must continue to resist. Vigilance required wakefulness, his duty demanded consciousness, regardless of his body's increasing preference for rest. The room's temperature had increased slightly following his addition of fresh coal, the enhanced combustion producing additional heat that radiated outward, reaching him even at his position behind the sideboard. This increased warmth was welcome, providing comfort that helped counter his fatigue, giving his body one less discomfort to manage. He appreciated the fire's warmth without analyzing the appreciation, simply accepting it as one of the evening's minor pleasures. His thoughts had become increasingly fragmentary, no longer following extended chains of reasoning but instead jumping from observation to observation, lingering briefly on each before moving to the next without clear connection or purpose. This mental state was itself evidence of fatigue, the mind's resources depleting just as the body's had, both gradually approaching the point where rest would become necessity rather than preference. Yet substantial time remained before that point would be reached. His constitution was strong enough to sustain wakefulness for hours yet, his sense of duty sufficient to override physical desire for rest. He would maintain his post through the established period of evening vigilance, would continue his watch until the hour came when retirement could be justified, when the likelihood of travelers arriving had diminished to effective impossibility, when his presence at the sideboard served no practical purpose beyond stubborn adherence to routine. That hour had not yet arrived. The night remained young enough that travelers, though increasingly unlikely, could not be entirely dismissed as impossible. His readiness must be maintained, his position preserved, his attention available should circumstances suddenly require it. This requirement sustained him, gave purpose to his continued wakefulness, justified the discomfort and fatigue that accumulated with each passing hour. The clock marked another quarter hour with its single chime, the sound now so familiar that it barely registered in his conscious awareness, noted and immediately forgotten, serving its purpose of marking time without demanding attention or response. The evening progressed, minutes becoming hours, hours building toward that eventual morning that waited beyond the present darkness, beyond the continuing quiet, beyond his patient vigil. The keeper's hands on the sideboard had grown completely still, all tendency toward unconscious movement exhausted, his fingers resting without tension or effort, merely occupying space, maintaining contact with the wood's surface. This stillness extended through his entire body, every part having found its position and settled into it, conserving energy through absolute economy of motion. His gaze rested on the middle distance, not focused on any particular object but taking in the room as a whole, the overall scene rather than specific details. The fire burned with renewed vigor following his attention, the lamps continued their steady glow, the furniture stood in its appointed places. Everything maintained its proper state, everything fulfilled its function, the inn remaining ready despite the absence of anyone to serve, preserving its standards through the keeper's sustained vigilance and the simple fact of its own continued existence. Time advanced through its measured progression, the present continuously becoming past, the future continuously becoming present, the eternal flow that carried all moments from possibility through actuality into memory. The keeper existed within this flow, experiencing each moment as it arrived, releasing it as it departed, neither anticipating nor regretting, simply present in the ongoing now that constituted his vigil. The evening continued, patient and unhurried, moving toward its conclusion without haste or delay, simply progressing through the hours that separated this moment from morning's eventual arrival. The keeper would see it through, maintaining his post, tending fire and lamps, preserving readiness, fulfilling his function through reliable presence and sustained attention. This was his work, his purpose, his contribution to the inn's operation, and he would perform it faithfully until the time came when it could properly be set aside, when duty released him to seek the rest his body increasingly desired but could not yet be permitted to claim. The keeper remained at his post as the night deepened further still, the hours accumulating with patient inevitability. His vigil continued through another round of fire tending, another circuit of the room, another period of stillness behind the sideboard. The lamps burned steadily, their oil reservoirs gradually emptying. The fire consumed its fuel with reliable consistency. The clock marked each quarter hour with its singular chime, measuring time's passage with mechanical precision. His body had long since passed beyond the stage of minor discomfort into a state of profound weariness, every muscle expressing its preference for rest, every joint protesting continued wakefulness. Yet he persisted, maintaining his position through will and habit, through the ingrained sense that his duty was not yet complete, that the proper hour for retirement had not yet arrived. The room remained ready, the fire burned, the lamps glowed, and he kept his watch. Finally, as the clock prepared to mark an hour so late that even the most optimistic assessment could not justify continued vigilance, the keeper acknowledged what his body had been insisting for some time. No travelers would arrive now. The night had progressed beyond the point where anyone might reasonably be seeking shelter. His continued presence at the sideboard served no practical purpose, fulfilled no actual need, satisfied only his own reluctance to abandon a post he felt obligated to maintain. He rose from the stool one final time, his body protesting the movement with particular vigor, joints stiff and muscles reluctant. He made a last circuit of the room, checking each lamp, adjusting one that had burned slightly lower than the others, ensuring all remained safe to burn unattended through what remained of the night. At the hearth, he used the poker to arrange the coals one final time, positioning them to burn slowly through the dark hours, maintaining enough heat that the morning fire could be easily rebuilt from their remnants. The door was secured, he confirmed, the bolt firmly in place. The windows were properly curtained against the cold. Everything was as it should be, the inn ready for morning, prepared for whatever the new day might bring. His work was complete, his vigil fulfilled, his duty adequately performed despite the absence of anyone to serve. With a final glance around the room that had occupied his attention for so many hours, the keeper extinguished all but one lamp, the single flame sufficient to light his way should he need to return during the night. The room fell into deeper shadow, the fire's glow becoming more prominent as lamplight withdrew, creating an atmosphere of settled rest that matched his own need for sleep. He climbed the narrow stairs to his quarters above, each step requiring deliberate effort, his body heavy with fatigue. The small room that awaited him was cold, having received no heat from the fire below, but his bed offered the promise of rest that had been building in him for hours. He prepared for sleep with minimal ritual, his movements automatic and efficient, driven by the desire to complete this final task and surrender at last to the rest he had so long denied himself. As he settled beneath the covers, feeling their weight and warmth gradually envelope him, he released the watchfulness that had sustained him through the evening's long hours. His breathing deepened, his muscles relaxed, his mind began its drift toward unconsciousness. The inn stood firm around him, the village slept in darkness beyond, and the keeper, his vigil complete, allowed himself to follow them into the profound rest that the night existed to provide. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening here. If you enjoyed our story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. If these peaceful hours brought you tranquility, perhaps you can come back another night. Until then, may your sleep be deep and your dreams peaceful. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.